My name is Jeffrey Tucker. I'm working for the Mises Institute, and we're doing a series of small videos, short videos, on our new book, Economics in One Listen. It's, of course, not a new book. It's a very old book by Henry Hazlitt. And it's my great pleasure to sit here with the scholar who wrote the introduction to the book, Walter Block.
I'm delighted to be here with you, Jeff. It's just wonderful.
So how do you think the book turned out? Do you like the look of it?
Oh, wow. It's a labor of love. It's magnificent. This is one of my very favorite books of all bookdom, so to speak, and it looks very good. I'm delighted that I was asked to write the introduction, and I looked at it again, and I was amazed that me and Henry Hazlitt are now buddies. It's just magnificent.
So I was so inspired by your last paragraph of your introduction. Do you mind if I read it?
Please.
Yeah, and this takes away all your good stuff for this interview, but so here we go.
Okay.
In summary, I feel like a party host introducing two guests to one another, who hopes they will like each other. I hope you will like this book, but more, I hope it will affect your life in somewhat the same way it has mine. It has inspired me to promote economic freedom. Indeed, to never shut up about it. Yeah, very funny. It has convinced me that free market economics is as beautiful in its way as a prism, a diamond, a sunset, the smile of a baby. We're talking the verbal equivalent of Mozart or Bach here. This book lit up my life, and I hope you get something a lot from it too. So that's a very nice paragraph.
Oh, you're very kind. Thanks. That came right from the heart. I meant every word of it. Sometimes people say, well, this laissez-faire capitalism, free market, it's so unlikely to occur. I mean, you got Obama and you got McCain, and neither of them are laissez-faire economist types. And poor Ron Paul, who is, was given the back of the hand by the American electorate. And they say, well, it's so impractical. And one of my retorts, and I have many, is that it's so beautiful. And even if it's never implemented, it's just so glorious. The idea of it, it's sort of like, I mean, I love Mozart and Bach, but I couldn't compose anything like that. And I couldn't appreciate, I'm not a professional musician, but to me, Mozart and Bach and Hazlitt and Mises and Rothbard are all intertwined. Even though obviously there are differences, some work in words, others work in musical notes, but I see, weirdo that I am, I see great connections between them. And I'm just honored to have been able to devote my professional life to creating beautiful music with words.
Right.
Now, there are obviously other retorts, more practical ones. For example, no one expected the Berlin Wall to topple when it toppled. No one expected the Soviet Union to go belly up when it went belly up. And if we didn't have a plan as to how to privatize and how the market would work, it's as if we'd be caught with our pants down around our ankles. So even though right now in the U.S. things look gloomy for free enterprise, Ron Paul experience, what have you, he didn't win. So far, anyway. We can always hope. Maybe one day the Washington, D.C. wall will fall, similar to the Berlin Wall. And until we have some sort of understanding of free market economics, we will be greatly embarrassed.
Why do you suppose we need a book like this to help us understand economics?
Well, this, I think, is the best introduction to economics of our type, Austro-libertarian economics. I know of no better introduction. I know of better essays or long written works like Human Action and Man, Economy, and State, but those are 500, 600, 700 pages. This is, 150 pages or something like that. How many pages is it?
Let's see. It's 188. 89, and that includes the index.
Okay, so without the index in my introduction, 150 isn't too far off. Maybe it's 170. So you can give it to someone and say, look, read this as your first book. This is my first book in economics. I was converted to libertarianism by Ayn Rand and Nathaniel Branden. And Nathaniel Branden, most of all, gave me 2 books, and he said, read these 2 books, and then we'll discuss them. And one was this one, Economics in One Lesson. The other was Atlas Shrugged. And in my introduction economics classes, I give my students what I was given. And it worked for me, and has worked for some of my students. Some of my students really get the message, and I think they get it from Economics in One Lesson by Henry Hazlitt.
So why is it that people can't just intuitively figure out economic science by looking around the world?
Oh no, I think that their intuitions are very much the opposite. Every freshman class I get, when I say that the minimum wage law is not really a good thing for the poor, they think I'm callous and unfeeling, because obviously you raise the minimum wage and everyone's better off, and you know, it's sort of like the Grinch that stole Christmas to oppose that. Or rent control lowers rents for poor people, and who could be against that? So instinctively good kids, 17, 18, 19-year-old freshmen, they're filled with the milk of human kindness, and they want the poor to be helped, but they don't realize that it doesn't work. Now, could you call upon that Pythagorean thing that you read to me before we started our interview? Because that's very apropos to the point that I'm trying to make.
I'll probably never be able to find it again. Yeah, no, it's right here.
Okay, good.
Right to it. So Hazlitt's talking about, about the Bastiat lesson concerning what you can see and what you can't see, and how you can't always trust what you see. So he says, as a character in Bernard Shaw's St. Joan replies when told of the theory of Pythagoras that the earth is round and revolves around the sun, "What an utter fool! Couldn't he use his eyes?"
Right. Sometimes, I mean, I think that's a beautiful passage, and it really illustrates my answer to your question about young students and why do they need this book? Why don't they instinctively see it? Their instincts they're very much opposite. As it is, I mean, it looks as if the sun revolves around the earth. I mean, it starts in the east and it goes to the west. I mean, can't you use your eyes, you dummy? You should be able to see that. Well, in a similar way, you have to do more than your eyes, or more than a superficial look at minimum wage, at rent control, at tariffs and free trade and all the other issues that Hazlitt goes through, to see beneath the surface. Yeah. And I think also sociobiologically, we all are hardwired to accept explicit cooperation. You know, you're hurt, I'll soothe you, I'll get a cold compress for you, what have you. But implicit cooperation through markets, we're not hardwired through biology to accept that. The best example I can think of is I come from New Orleans, I teach at Loyola University, and we had Katrina. And right after Katrina, the prices rose of flashlight batteries and candles and orange juice and things like that. And everyone was saying, oh, they're price gougers, they're evil, instinctively. Yeah. And when the governor of the state of Louisiana said, I'm going to put price gougers in jail, everyone said, yeah, right on, put those so-and-sos into jail. It takes economics of the sort that Economics in One Lesson provides you to understand that there's a function of higher prices, namely it rations goods and it calls forth new supplies. Otherwise, all we can rely on is benevolence. We can't rely on self-interest. But most people are not hardwired to see that. They can't appreciate implicit cooperation, namely through prices and markets and profits and property rights and things like that. All they can instinctively appreciate is charity. Yeah. Okay, so Walmart brings in a whole bunch of things, that's good. That would be like seeing the sun going, around the earth, or rather the earth going around the sun. So I think the answer to your question is that people instinctively are anti-market. Yeah. And it takes an effort of will or understanding or knowledge of the sort that Henry Hazlitt so magnificently supplies to pierce through this ignorance.
So let me ask about that. Why is it that there's only one Economics in One Lesson? Why is it very difficult to write a book like this? A clean, clear, timeless introduction to economics? Why is that so difficult?
Well, I think there are many. David Gordon has an introduction to economics. I think Callahan has one. There are others, but it's sort of like, why is there only one Mozart or one Bach? Well, there are others. I mean, there is Haydn and Handel, Salieri. I mean, my own book, Defending the Undefendable, is sort of an homage to this. Sure. At least the way I see it, what they both have in common, and I'm not comparing the quality, but just the motif. Both have a main message and then 30 implications. Yes. For example, his main message is the lesson. My main message is the law of non-aggression. and then we both apply it to 30 places. So in a sense, when I wrote my book, Defending the Undefendable, I had this one in mind.
Right.
Only it was my seeing it through my eyeglasses. Now, obviously, these two books don't deserve to be mentioned even in the same sentence, but you know, if there's a Mozart and a Salieri, there can be a Hazlitt and a Bloch. I mean, all you can do is do your best. Yeah. And there are many of us at the Mises Institute right now, the faculty, 12 of us or so. We're all trying to contribute. Now, none of us is a Hazlitt, none of us is a Mozart or a Mises or a Rothbard, but we're all doing our best, and we're trying to uphold the tradition.
But how do you account for why the book still seems so fresh, even though it was written so long ago?
In my introduction, what I said is that except for that crack about Eleanor Roosevelt, it looks as if it was ripped from today's headlines. And if he would have just put Hillary instead of Eleanor Roosevelt, you probably couldn't tell. I mean, the book first came out in 46.
46, yeah.
And now it's 2008. I think that's 52 years or something, or 62 years. 72 years. My math is a little weak. It's a long time. It's almost 100. Soon it'll be 100 years. And that book will be as fresh in 2042 as it was in 2046.
And apparently he just ripped it off. I mean, not ripped it off. He just banged it out. I mean, he left the New York Times in a split. And he just sat down at the typewriter and wrote this out and didn't think anything much would come of it. Isn't that interesting?
Well, he was inspired, maybe. Yeah. Maybe he was channeling something higher than him. Who knows? I'm not a religious person, but he might have been inspired or something. Yeah. It's just beautiful. You know, forget about the content for the moment. I mean, the content is beautiful. It's perfect. There's no mistake. But the way he writes, I mean, he was inspired. I mean, it's just so beautiful, just on an aesthetic basis, apart from the economic basis. It's so well written. I mean, there are very few people who can write like that. Murray Rothbard was one. But the rest of us lesser beings, you know, convoluted sentences, and it's hard to understand, and relatively speaking, to these geniuses.
Yeah. One of the things we had in mind when we put out the introduction is we wanted to make it a beautiful book, hardback, and cheap.
Yes.
So, I don't know, maybe this has happened to you, but oftentimes I'll have people over to dinner, just guests, and the subject of economics will come up. And you don't want to waste the whole dinner talking about economic theory.
What?
Well, oh, you do?
How dare you? How dare you say that?
You do want to do that, right? Okay. Let's say you do, but you want to give them even more. I've always wanted to have a stack of these in my house, so that I could say, oh, by the way, here, let me just get it. Oh, please take it with you. Yeah. And so that's the idea, you know, is that you can own some and give them out.
Lou Rockwell gave a brilliant speech at one of the Mises seminars. I forget in what city. I've been to so many, they all blend together. And what he said is, you're at a dinner party, and everyone's nice, and everyone's talking about, you know, the weather or the sports or something, and all of a sudden someone says something like, you know, we got to have protective tariffs. And you know, your spoon is halfway to your mouth, and you sort of, what? And I think that would be a perfect antidote to that. Yeah. You don't have to, what's the expression, don't get mad, get even? Don't lose your soup halfway to your lip, but just resolve that after the dinner is over. Say, you know, you might be interested in this book. And if you've got a stack of them, and what do they sell for?
It's like $12.
$12. Well, at today's prices, that's like 3 gallons of gas or something. You know, you can give them not promiscuously, but you know, on a needed basis.
Right. Once you see a spark of interest, and say, well, here's an issue you need to confront, which is namely economic logic.
Yeah.
And you can hold whatever political views you want, but you need to think about the economics behind it.
Yeah, another title for that book that would have been good would have been Economic Logic in One Lesson. Yeah. If you wanted other titles that would be equally good or roughly as good. I mean, I'm not changing the title, I'm not for that, but Economic Logic, I think, is a very good way of putting it.
Do you suppose that it's one of the best-selling economics books that's ever been printed?
I think it is. I know that Atlas Shrugged is a magnificent bestseller. I mean, it came out in '56, and it's still selling by the bushel load. But it's not really an economics book, although it is, but it's a novel. But this is not a novel, and Hazlitt has written novels.
Yes.
This is just a textbook, a very short textbook. I use it in my classes as an adjunct to a mainstream textbook, and say here's the good stuff. And a lot of times this attracts the student interest in a way that the dry textbook.
It's nice
doesn't.
To compare them, isn't it? To have
Yes,
them both.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Walter, for not only for writing an introduction, but for agreeing to this quick interview.
Oh, it's my pleasure, Jeff.
Ready for part 2 of our series, and I'm here with Thomas DiLorenzo from Loyola University in Baltimore, and we're going to get into the very heart of the book, Economics in One Lesson, now here with you. But I'd like to just read this one sentence and ask you to defend it here. He says, "It is often sadly remarked that the bad economists present their errors to the public better than the good economists present their truths." What do you think about that?
Was talking about the broken window fallacy, I assume, in that passage, and that's, you can't really be an economist or think like an economist unless you understand the broken window fallacy, I think, which is the essence of opportunity cost. And one way I explain it to my classes is, I teach at a Catholic university, and we're always encouraging students to engage in some sort of community service. So I tell the class that the economics department has our own version of community service. We're going to buy each of you an aluminum baseball bat, and we're all going to march down North Charles Street, which is the main street north and south in Baltimore. We're going to bash in all the windows of the cars all the way down, and it's a job creation program. That's our community service, I tell them. And then I ask them, what kind of jobs do you think we'll create in the city of Baltimore? We'll reduce unemployment, we'll reduce poverty. And they scratch their heads for a minute, and they, glass repair, garbage collection, extra private security guards, and I write down on a blackboard a list of all the jobs we're going to create. and then I ask them, well, why don't we burn down some buildings on the way? That'll create even more. We'll eliminate poverty altogether, won't we? And then they start thinking about it. Well, wait a minute, there's something wrong here about this. And if they've already read sort of the theory of opportunity cost, they'll catch on that, of course, that's what's seen. Those jobs are seen, the glass repairmen and all that. But what is not seen is all the resources that had to be transferred from somewhere else or reallocated, and jobs destroyed there so that we can fix up the glass and hire the security guards and so forth. And so the whole key to thinking like an economist really is to think about what is not seen as well as what is seen, in the words of the immortal Friedrich Bastiat.
Right. Well, and yet it seems like it would be something easy to understand once you hear the story of the broken window, and to understand the fallacy, and perhaps to see what's wrong with it. If that's so, why is it so persistent?
I think economic miseducation has a lot to do with it. I think economists, especially including academic economists, when they teach, are so enamored with mathematics and model building that they ignore or downplay the basic fundamental truths of economics, like opportunity cost, because it's so mundane. It's not, you can't really model it or can't express it in mathematics that well, and they tend to forget about it. And then students who take classes, they might learn these sophisticated models, but they don't learn really basic economics. And that's why the Austrian School of Economics has always been so appealing to me. It's always been rooted in understanding how the economic world works, as opposed to showing off your math skills.
Right.
And I think economic miseducation is the main reason why so many people and members of the public don't get this real simple idea.
So opportunity costs are always invisible, so they don't show up in the economic data.
Right.
So
not always. Sometimes some of them do.
And this makes it less interesting than for an empirical economist.
Right. Yeah. On the empirical side, the old joke about the economist looking for his watch across the street when he knew he lost it on the other side of the street. And when he's asked, why are you looking for your watch over there when you know you lost it over here? And he says, the light is better over there. That's very true about economists, because when they undergo their research, if they do empirical research, they're limited by what kind of data they can get. Even though there are very important questions that need to be asked and addressed that you just can't measure empirically all the time. And so they tend to ignore these things. And so there's a lot of truth to that old joke about the economist and his watch.
So Hazlitt calls this chapter 2, after he explains the lesson, he calls it the blessings of destruction.
Right. He talks a lot about war and the idea that things such as war can be good for the economy, war prosperity. You heard that phrase. And of course, some people do become wealthy through war, the people who sell munitions to the government and so forth. That's what's seen. You see that. But then once again, what is not seen is all the resources that are taken out of the pockets of the taxpayers to pay for it. And also another slightly more sophisticated part of this is that, the market system is one big network that displays the international division of labor. And it's peaceful and cooperative. We work together to produce goods and services, and we buy and sell from one another. War is just the opposite. War is blowing things up and destroying things and killing people. And so the very idea that war can produce prosperity in any sense is absurd on the face of it. And Henry Hazlitt explains that as simply and as straightforwardly as anybody I've ever read in just a couple of paragraphs, really. And von Mises does a great job of that also in Human Action in his chapter on war and the economy.
It's also true with natural disasters.
Right.
We played this game on the Mises blog. Anytime there's a fire or a flood or anything, we do see how many days it'll be before a professional economist makes a statement.
We always end up digging up an article from the New York Times or the LA Times, so there's some pseudo-economist saying, well, the bright side is that it's good for the economy. In fact, there was an earthquake in Southern California yesterday as we sit here at the Mises Institute on July 30th. And sure enough, I bet tomorrow, if we do a web search, we'll find a statement like this of thank goodness in this time of the housing crisis and the subprime crisis, and we're in a recession, God sent us an earthquake in Southern California. Somebody's going to say something like that. And when they do, I think we should send that person a copy of Economics in One Lesson. Whatever reporter we discover says that thing.
So do you find that your teaching in your introductory classes consists of just day after day of applying this lesson in different ways?
Not just introductory classes. I taught a new course I put together called The Political Economy of War, and the very first week of readings involved the broken window fallacy and Ludwig von Mises on war and the economy, in which he elaborates on the broken window fallacy, among other things. So real basic economics to get you to think about the economic consequences of war, and certainly the broken window fallacy is certainly one of them.
Yeah. Do you think this new edition will be helpful to you?
Oh yes, it's a beautiful edition, and it's priced very well. And congratulations on being able to do that. And I'm sure I'll be buying box loads of them, because I always have. For 20 years, I've been buying copies of Economics in One Lesson, because as an economics professor, I run into people all the time who ask me, what one book can I read that's not too complicated and technical, with a lot of math, and understand economics? And Economics in One Lesson is that book.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dr.
My pleasure.
This is Jeffrey Tucker at the Mises Institute. I'm sitting here with Jeffrey Herbener of Grove City College. He's agreed to talk to us about a couple of chapters from this book, Economics in One Lesson, our new edition. And the book is now about 62 years old, and it still holds up.
Yeah, it's great. It's a fabulous book. Everyone's first introduction to sound economics. Still after
Do you
62
use
years.
it at Grove City?
We use it in Grove City. We have a course in public policy, and so it provides a first introduction to sound thinking on public policy.
You mean that all students take a public policy course in addition to an economics class?
The econ, no, it would be mainly econ majors or majors
Okay.
in political science and history, those that are interested in policy questions.
Do they take an economics 101 class before they take public
Yes.
policy?
Yes, they do.
But why wouldn't you use it in 101?
Why wouldn't we use it
Right.
in 101? In 101, we want to, well, we would use it. I mean, it's up to the professor's discretion to use it on questions of, relevant questions of policy that come up.
I see.
Yeah, but it's not like a theoretical, it's not a sort of praxeological, theoretical development in the book. It's the lesson and then the applications.
Right.
So it's a succinct, it's a very nice, succinct statement of the lesson that's excellent for applications once you get to that point in the principles class.
I see. So, but you're thinking about students as learning a sort of more conventional technical economics, more of a
Right, say in a 101 class, right? We would just begin and develop economic theory from praxeological. Yes, in microeconomics.
Okay.
And then once in a micro class, you get to the questions of policy, the middle part of the class or toward the end. Then Hazlitt's book would be
okay. So when most people think about economics and its relevance today, they're thinking about that second step.
That's right.
Yeah, because that's the economics we encounter
Sure.
day to day. When we pick up the newspaper, we're not reading about the theory of marginal utility.
Exactly right.
Right.
and this is exactly the sort of thing that the non-economist student confronts when they think about public policy, right? They have to confront this big lesson.
Yeah.
And if they don't get the lesson, they're just awash in all sorts of nonsense.
Yeah. And yet you learn a lot of economic theory. Would you say?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And so the topic we're discussing now concerns public works and taxes.
And taxes.
Okay,
right.
so let's talk about the first chapter. It's public work.
Right. So in this chapter, what Hazlitt does is develop a sort of extended argument about public works. He says, look, many people say the justification for public works isn't the grandeur of the thing that's produced. It's that it provides employment. So we can justify the building of a bridge or building of streets or buildings and so on the grounds that this provides employment to people. And of course, the point he's making is that this is always diversion, right? We're simply diverting employment from one area to another, precisely because the expenditures to build the public works require taxation, and so we're just funneling, right, shifting the resource use. And again, this basic notion of scarcity and the reallocation of things is totally lost on non-economists or those who aren't introduced to economic reasoning. Right. And so it's a wonderful point.
So this is 1946, and very fresh in his mind is the experience of the New Deal,
right,
and World War II, and
right,
this is
exactly.
a very common argument.
It is very common. He gives the example the TVA, one of the public works projects that he uses to illustrate his point.
He talks about the grandeur of the wonderful
the dams and and all the things, wonderful things generated from this electricity.
And this is what you see.
This is what you see, but you do not see the diversion, right? What it's been diverted from.
Yeah.
And of course, he doesn't really, to make his point, this is the beauty of Hazlitt's writing, he doesn't really have to go deeply into the sort of theoretical background, sort of what's behind the weighing of the different values of things that are produced in one area of the economy relative to another, in order to drive this point home. So you don't find extended discussions about entrepreneurial calculation and how a profit has to be the test of whether or not the thing is justified and so on and so forth to see that he's right about this.
Yeah, and yet it does strike you as somewhat absurd that bureaucrats could decide, we need an enormous dam over there that way.
That's right.
We need a highway here.
That's right.
I mean, how do we know these things?
Yeah.
How do we know?
Yeah, but he raises this question, and he sort of his rhetoric is sort of We always dwell just only upon the thing that we see, and we ignore the thing that we do not see. What happens to our analysis if we include the thing we do not see?
Right.
And he just leaves it at that point. Right?
Now, it's not so much an argument you hear these days, is it, that public works are necessary to employ people? You don't hear it that much.
No.
You do sometimes. It's more sector specific, like, well, here's a population that's sort of distressed in some way.
Right.
But it's not a macro.
No, you're right about that. Yeah, like you said before, it's in the context of the Depression.
Yeah.
And that he's thinking about.
It's because unemployment is so low now.
Right.
And yet, the magazines and newspapers are filling up now with the news of the impending movement towards national service. Right?
Very true.
Yeah. And so the idea is that you just enslave people between the age of 18 and 20, or 21 or 22. But you have to, and I guess this argument in some way impacts on this, doesn't it? Leaving aside human rights considerations.
Yeah, right. Yes, there's the mundane economic aspect.
So apply it to that.
So that would be the diversion again, right? So we see what the public service would be done by this conscripted labor, but we don't see the value of the alternative. And of course, when we think more deeply about it, we realize that, again, here's a question of entrepreneurship, of the individual's entrepreneurial choice to say, I, in my own mind, can weigh these alternatives. Should I, work in a soup kitchen for the summer? Should I volunteer for the Peace Corps? Should I go into business and become an entrepreneur? Should I go to a graduate school and extend my education and so on? Right. That the individual person is perfectly capable of making this decision based upon his own entrepreneurial abilities.
Can you imagine what it will mean for national productivity, if you care about that kind of thing, to rob the economy of 2 or 3 years?
It's amazing.
Of young people's lives, get them, away from webmastering and gaining skills in the private sector.
No, it's
and
horrible.
Have them doing what?
Yeah, who knows what, right?
That's the scary part, right?
Yeah.
I mean, who knows what? It could be anything. It's whatever the politicians dream up.
Dream up, and they dream a lot.
Yeah.
They all have a dream.
They'll become spies. that's the idea. To make sure we support Homeland Security or whatever the thing is. Now, the next chapter deals with taxes, and it's a topic on which you've written. And the title is Taxes Discourage Production, which, once you hear those 3 words, it sounds unobjectionable. And yet it requires some fleshing out, doesn't it?
Right, and what Hazlitt says in this chapter is, again, the repetition or application of the basic lesson. So, we have this case, where the subsidy is provided to someone and everybody says hurrah and look at the wonderful thing that's been done by the state and how it's benefited the recipient, person A, let's say. But they totally ignore, they realize that taxes have been raised to pay for this, but they ignore the effect on the behavior of B, the state of condition that B is in, right? They dwell upon the condition of A, the allegedly improved condition of A. Yeah. And so he simply says, well, look, let's consider this. What happens when you tax the productivity of the productive output of someone? Well, they're not going to just sit still for this, right? This changes their behavior. Just like the subsidy changes the behavior of A, presumably for the better, but not obviously necessarily.
Now, why can't you just say, well, actually, when you tax people, it's true that it takes away some of their money, but that fact alone encourages people to work even more, so become even more productive, to make up for the difference.
Yeah, people do kind of try to claim this, but of course, this is sort of a confusion of the notion of productivity, right? What exactly do we mean by productivity? We're producing value. Okay, so what is the value that we're producing? Who decides on what is a valuable thing to be produced? And of course, this is the producer. This is Hazlitt's point, right? What's being produced is what the producer himself deems to be valuable. And so if he's, he runs a business and he's not being taxed, or he's being taxed lightly, and so he's producing goods in his business and selling them, Okay, so he's choosing this as the valuable alternative, and he's having it ratified by the purchase of the consumers and so on. So if he's taxed and he does something else, so now his he lessens his productivity in this area, and he instead he paints or whatever, then well, of course, this is something that he himself deems less valuable. He's doing this only as, again, a diversion of, and so his productivity is diverted. If he works harder in his business to produce extra income to make up for this, he once again is diverting, right, from things that he personally considers more valuable into less valuable.
Time.
So the objective features of what he does in his action aren't definitive in determining what is production or what is productivity. This can only be determined in the value sense. And this is what's being diverted.
Well, so why isn't it a good argument then to say, let's not tax productivity, let's tax consumption?
Right. Well, this is Rothbard's great contribution, right, in tax incidence theory, where he pointed out that all taxes are, in fact, income taxes. So if you tax consumption, that tax gets imputed back to production. In other words, a businessman who...
You mean all taxes are taxes on production?
On production. What did I say?
Income.
Well, they're...
Same thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, in the context of our discussion, we can treat that as the same thing. Yeah, they're taxes on wealth, or things produced, right? Okay, so so the idea would be if you tax consumption, you have a sales tax, or you have a general sales tax, or an excise tax, or something like this, that once again, it's the entrepreneur who decides how to adjust to this. He isn't a passive recipient of the taxation or payer of it. He adjusts his production. What he does, of course, is of necessity, since his costs are raised by the taxes, he has to lower his costs in other areas. This means lessening his demand for labor, shrinking back his capital expenditures, and so on. So this falls upon someone's income. Some producer's productivity is impacted by this.
Yeah. So there's no way to tax
that's right.
Consumption.
No,
really.
Consumption cannot be taxed.
It can't be taxed.
No, it can't be. Only things produced, only wealth, only income.
But it's often said that, if we tax, put a sales tax on beer or cigarettes or whatever the thing happens to be, then the producer's not paying, and it's only the consumer, and then that becomes voluntary, because then you can choose not to purchase it. And this is a very...
Yeah, I once had this conversation actually at an academic conference I had presented something on taxation, and I was making this previous point that we made about taxes being imputed backwards, and he said, no, he made exactly your point, right? No, wait a minute, isn't this just sort of voluntarily paid by the consumer? And I said, sure, right, this is Rothbard's point too, right? A consumer voluntarily pays the full price, and all the costs of production, including taxes, are taken out of this, so to speak, or covered by that revenue for the entrepreneur. It's the entrepreneur who's being coerced. He's the one who is fills the hand of the state, pressing upon him to take his income.
Right.
And then his behavior changes. So without the hand of the state here, his production decisions are different, and prices are mitigated, and supplies are increased, and incomes are higher, and so on.
Yeah. Now, whenever I've... let me ask you this. When you present to your students various arguments about the impact of taxes on economic growth, does anybody ever raise their hand and say, well, Professor Herbener, how do you propose taxes be structured in a way that will not be damaging?
Right. In fact, I teach the course in public finance at Grove City College. And so I kind of avoid this this line of questioning by beginning at the very starting point of analysis, to take students through step by step, the production on the market and so on and so forth, and then the theories of market failure and what have you, so that by the time we get to the point where we're discussing the taxation and the transfers of resources, they've been disabused of the notion that, look, the government has to have a certain tax base in order to provide this or that particular good or set of goods, because these are public goods, or the market has failed here, and there's an externality, and something has to be done by the state.
But at least if you're going to impose a tax, at least be aware of the cost. Right?
Right. And it is true that there are perhaps taxes. One could say that the extent to which a tax is neutral is not the same for every tax.
Yeah.
Right. So Rothbard himself points out that this is one of the strikes against income taxes. Yeah. Income taxes tend to, in practice, actually be less neutral because there's more revenue taken by the state than, say, an excise tax or a tariff or something like this. Right.
And it's fascinating how our public policy ethos seems to recognize the truth of what Hazlitt is saying. Whenever you have proposals from the left and the right for so-called tax holidays.
Yes, that's right. Suddenly.
Isn't it strange?
Yeah. Suddenly our eyes are open.
Yeah. Let's have a tax holiday. Oh, that'll be great for business.
Yeah.
It's funny. Why don't we just make it everywhere?
Right?
Yeah, permanent all over the whole country. Yeah. And reading through the chapter, is it your sense that the theoretical apparatus of economics that he's addressing here, the fallacies that he's addressing, do they seem like they've changed that much over the 60 years?
No, I don't think so.
No, they haven't changed much.
I think they're very simple. No, they haven't changed.
Yeah.
Basically, it's the same fallacy over and over again.
I get that impression from the whole book.
Right. Right.
He seems to have picked out a whole series of issues that seem to be
timeless, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, timeless. Universal fallacies held by all people at all times and all places. Yeah. Well, thank you for helping us unravel some of these today.
Thank you, Jeff.
Herbener. This is Jeffrey Tucker. I'm at the Mises Institute, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Tom Woods. We're talking about his book, Economics in One Lesson. Oh, wait a minute. That's not yours. It's one of the books you didn't write.
That's
a rare case. Yeah. Okay, so this was written long before you and I were born.
Right.
1946.
I wish I'd written it, though. What has it sold? 2 million copies? That'd be
There's
it.
some serious royalties
Yeah,
if we negotiated a contract.
Yeah,
about it.
that's right. Yeah.
And so we're talking about just one chapter. And it occurs fairly early in the book, and it concerns government loans. So the idea is that if the private markets will not suffice to fund a particular program or project or service, so we have to get the government involved in it. And this was 1946, and my goodness, these government loan markets have vastly expanded in that time, haven't they?
Sure, with the same rationale and everything to boot. That's right. Well, it's useful to bear in mind the theme of the whole book here for this chapter, which is his emphasis on what is seen versus what is not seen. That if you're going to think like an economist, you have to think of the consequences for everybody over the long term of whatever it is the government is doing. So he gives the example of a farmer who's applying for some loan so that he can buy a tractor or some such thing. And he contrasts the situations of farmers A and B. A has a track record for honesty and paying his debts and being creditworthy, and he's also got some assets that can be used as collateral. But then you've got B, who has no assets, he's got no track record, he might even be on government relief. And so the argument is, well, why shouldn't B get a chance? And the only chance he could possibly have is if the government lends him the money, intervenes in the credit market to lend him the money. And Hazlitt's argument is to note that we should remember that what's really being lent here isn't so much the money as it is the tractor, and then he's going to pay back and once he can. But there's a fixed number of tractors at any given time. So if I lend a tractor to one person, there's somebody else who can't get the tractor. And so what he suggests is that when you lend this additional money, this government provided credit to this one guy, you are depriving somebody else of this same property. You're depriving somebody who has worked to build up a reputation for honesty and a credit rating and so on. And so he keeps it in that light. Like, why is it morally preferable that this person should get this and crowd out this person out of the market? So that's the type of argument. And then he also reminds us that the private banking industry has every reason to be careful under normal conditions, by the way. Let's abstract from the Fed, but to be careful in how it makes loans, because if it makes a bad loan, well, then it's in big trouble. So it has to become very skilled at determining who is a reliable and a good credit risk and who isn't. Because, as I say, if they make a mistake, they lose their own funds. Whereas a government bureaucrat typically has no experience here, has taken some civil service exam, in which he's got to write about hypothetical people in hypothetical situations. And if one of these loans goes sour, well, there are no consequences. Nobody's fired. If anything, it just goes to show just how bad the situation is. We've got so many unfortunate people. Even this amount of government money hasn't helped them. We need even more. So, you cannot get the government into this business because it winds up making bad loans that for good reason the private sector didn't want to make.
And isn't it really something that in recent days with this housing calamity that's going on, that people are asking the question, well, what is it with the banks? They seem to have lent money where they shouldn't have. These people weren't creditworthy. And yet, the whole of government policy for the last, umpteen decades, whatever, has been designed to badger them
into doing exactly this.
Right.
Yeah, of course. Well, there's the one argument is the Community Reinvestment Act, which requires banks to make loans against their better judgment to groups that are perceived as having been discriminated against. Right. But as the record shows, in fact, just look at the statistics. If you look at various racial groups who are assumed to be discriminated against, there is no evidence for this, that in fact they have the same default rates as anybody else. If they were being held to some higher unreasonable standard, they wouldn't be defaulting as much. And then we also have the fact that Asian Americans get loans at a considerably higher rate than whites, and one assumes there's no particular reason for there to be a pervasive pro-Asian bias in the banking community. Right. So so in other words, the Community Reinvestment Act is based on a fallacy right off the bat involving discrimination. But it's intended to make loans to people who don't have very good credit ratings. And of course, the egalitarian mind hates the credit rating, which is the one great, criterion of, trustworthiness when it comes to money. Right. So banks have been required to make these loans, but it's not even just that. You've got, Hazlitt in his book wants to hold off credit creation until later, but there's no reason we have to be bound by that. The Federal Reserve System, of course, pumps all this additional money and credit into the system. And as a result, banks pretty much at any one time have made the loans they can make. So if they find themselves now with all this new, money on their hands, they've got to either lower the requirements, lower the qualifications to get the loan, or lower the interest rate. And so what they wind up doing is, again, making loans that under normal conditions they wouldn't have made. And then beyond this, we have these weird government-sponsored enterprises, they're called, Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. Right. Fannie Mae was once a full-fledged government agency. And then these things were really only came into their own as major players in the mortgage market about 10 or 15 years ago. Yeah. And they were
privatized.
Yeah, they're so-called privatized, even though they enjoy tax benefits no other comparable institution would enjoy. They have regulatory benefits. They also enjoy the status of having everyone basically know that if they get in trouble, they'll be bailed out.
Socialized losses.
Exactly. So the risk is socialized. And so therefore, that's another incentive for banks to make risky loans, because they know that Fannie and Freddie will just buy up these mortgages from them and assume the risk. And so, as Lou Rockwell points out, if you're inclined to say, well, wait a minute, the banks shouldn't be making these shaky loans in the first place, regardless of whether or not they can socialize the risk, Lou points out, well, look, the fact is, all your competitors are going to be doing this. All your competitors will be making these loans and making money, at least in the short run, on them. And you'll get eaten for breakfast if you don't play the game. So the government has so corrupted the system that even somebody who wants to be an honest banker can't do it.
No, yeah.
And of course, it's in the government's interest always to distract attention from its own responsibility for things. So it's not our price controls that are causing the meat shortages, it's the farmers hoarding the meat. It's not us who are we're not responsible for high oil prices. It's the price gougers at the pump. It's the oil companies, the evil oil companies. Or we're not responsible for the mortgage mess. It's these irresponsible lenders. It's never the government. So it's incredible, isn't it, over the years, what an absolutely pristine track record government has. It's never been responsible for anything.
It can only do good stuff.
Yeah.
And all of its regulations will always fix the problem.
We should just give all our money to the government.
Right.
In fact, you know, one of my favorite old shows was The Honeymooners, and a lot of times Jackie Gleason would sort of improvise when he would do his lines. And there was one show where at the end, you know, at first he was criticizing the government about taxes, and at the end he actually says, "We've got the best government in the world. We should give all our money to the government." I said, "Oh, not Jackie Gleason. No. Come on."
So Hazlitt nailed it in 46, and I suppose that there wasn't this big national priority yet that every person should own a mansion,
right,
a plywood palace. But it was soon to happen, a few years later, that somebody decided that the very definition of being an American is that you would own a home. And it took all these years for it to become this absurd bubble that's now exploded and is causing grave financial difficulties for us. So there might be other things out there. Now we've got the student loan problem, of course, that emerged sometime between the time Hazlitt wrote the book and today.
Yeah.
And maybe you can address that.
Well, sure. I mean, I'll just, in the interest of full disclosure, you know, I took out some student loans, but I'm one of the suckers who actually paid them back. You know, unlike the deadbeats who are running around all over the country going to Hawaii or something, not paying them back. But, you know, the fact is, though, that these student loans, first of all, the ready availability of all this free credit is itself at least largely responsible for inflating the price of a college education. Because if the institution knows you're bringing all this heavily subsidized loan money with you, well, the price is going to go up. I mean, if we funded the purchase of potato chips in the same way, it would cost, you know, $100,000 for a bag of chips, you know, so it shouldn't be a surprise. And, you know, I like what a lot of financial advisors are starting to say, which is that young kids are putting themselves in an impossible hole at the very beginning of their lives. You know, they start off in debt 160 grand or something. That's how they start their lives. And, you know, I mean, I've heard it said, you know, that if you were to take your money and put it in almost anything and just let it grow, it would have been better for you, even when you count the human capital you're building. It would have been better than if you went to college with it.
Yeah.
So, arguably, the best thing you should do is either, if you can possibly in high school, get a year's worth of college in with your AP courses, cut that down somehow, or finish college a year early, or spend 5 years there, but work part-time. Yeah, and then that way, yeah, exactly. But I mean, if you can get out a year early, you know, then this is, you know, there's an opportunity cost there that you no longer have to bear. You have an extra year's salary. I mean, you have to think of, you know, Gary North has a lot to say about this, but you have to think of unorthodox solutions to the price of an education. But the student loan situation is not helping young kids. It's absolutely burying them.
Right. So it really is a calamity. I mean, you've got this argument that, well, the government has to give these loans because private enterprise will not. And yet, it seems as if private enterprise will not, then they shouldn't be given at all.
Yeah, that's right. That's an indication that society in some way is making clear through the market the type of risks it's willing and interested in taking. I mean, it's somewhat analogous to the fact that, suppose in 1974, we had known how to make an iPod, let's say. But, of course, we just weren't at the level, like, the ability to produce the stuff was just still way, way beyond us. We could probably have produced an iPod in 1974, but when you think of all the resources that would have been required to extract from society toward this project, it would have been totally out of line with consumer desire. You know, so the market has a way of balancing the fact that, yes, we'd all like iPods in 1974, or we'd all like every single human being to have a 4-year education, you know, heavily subsidized. But the fact is, we can't have all these things. There's a trade-off involved, and the market helps us to balance these things out rationally.
You've written a lot about economics and morality. And your comment earlier about credit ratings being an indication of trustworthiness, and I wonder if you could elaborate on that, the extent to which credit and credit ratings actually help shape our characters.
Well, the way you put it, I'd love to hear you elaborate on this, as a matter of fact.
Well, no, it just occurred to me when you said that. I mean, this is one way that the markets helps train us.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And in fact, if you follow your credit rating, if you subscribe to any kind of service, it'll actually tell you, this is why your score is what it is. You've got these positive elements, but you've got these negative elements. You keep opening up new credit accounts.
Yeah.
You keep doing this or that, or you won't pay this bill. You're being a bum or something. And it tells you this. And if you want people to interact with you on the best possible terms, then you know exactly what you need to do, basically to improve your own character, not to take on purchases that you can't possibly really meet the cost of. I mean, you do learn these things, and these are good qualities that you should have as a human being. And also, we should bear in mind, we're not saying that, therefore, very, very few people should have houses. There's no way to know, there's no non-arbitrary way to determine how many people should live in homes they own, how many should rent. The market has to determine that. But I do think that maybe a lot of people should just have smaller homes.
Yeah.
You could still own your own home, but not everybody has to have a gigantic mansion. And I do kind of like Karen DeCoster's term that she invented that's now in the Urban Dictionary. It's the 2000aire. It's the guy, he's got the brand new home, the 2 beautiful cars, he goes on great vacations with his wife, and they've got $2,000 in the bank. So I mean, even the slightest calamity, and they are wiped out. Yeah. And the credit rating is there, in effect, to force you to best it can to try to prevent this thing from happening, to plan your life more sensibly and responsibly.
And it isn't interesting, too, that the more short-term, the more irresponsible you are, the more short-term you're thinking, the higher an interest rate you're going to pay. So at least there's a little bit of a punishment.
Yes, that's right. That's right.
Yeah.
The market is good all around in this sense.
We've made a good case, Dr. Woods.
Okay, pleasure being with you, Jeff.
My name is Jeffrey Tucker. I'm at the Mises Institute, and today I'm interviewing Robert Murphy, who's an economist, and we're going to be talking about one chapter from this new edition of Economics and One Lesson, a book that was published in 1946, republished now, and just as relevant as ever. And Dr. Murphy, the subject of the chapter we're discussing is has to do with jobs. Mm-hmm. And technology, right?
Right.
And the title of the chapter is
The Curse of Machinery.
The Curse of Machinery. Okay, so what does Hazlitt mean by the curse of machinery?
Well, he's referring to the fact, and he shows that it's gone back far back in history, that anytime a new technique is developed that is a labor-saving device, that people fear it because they think, oh, you're throwing people out of work. And so machinery is a curse because it's just causing unemployment. And so therefore we ought to resist the introduction of new machines, sometimes with the caveat, unless the machine doesn't save labor. So as long as it's not putting people out of work, then sometimes people say, okay, a new machine's a good thing. But if it causes the firm to lay off some people because now we have the machine doing the job of 10 men, then that's obviously bad. That's the
And he
idea.
talks about the Industrial Revolution and how this is a controversy. But even now, it's a controversy. Right. Even about the Industrial Revolution, you still read people say, well, it was really regrettable. It took people off the wonderful, their happy lives on their landed plots there and drove them to the city.
Right, and he goes through it. I like what he does in that chapter. So first, he just quotes people to make sure you believe he's not setting up a straw man. He just quotes people after people saying just what you've said, and people all the way up to Eleanor Roosevelt saying, well, yeah, in the past it was okay, but now this is really serious. Like during the Depression, this is serious. And yeah, people they have these false views about what happened in the past, and he goes through his statistics to show, actually, in a lot of these industries, with the new machines, for example, in the automobile industry, obviously there were more people employed in there in 1960 than in 1920, and so clearly the introduction of machinery didn't. But he goes through and just shows those examples, but then sort of makes the point also that, look, in the terms of the Industrial Revolution, in a sense, the population would have all starved to death if they didn't have all this new machinery coming into place. And so in a real sense, it created jobs because there are people working right now. It's not that there's 99% unemployment and most of the people would be dead if it weren't for the Industrial Revolution.
So he goes through and traces the effects, and the effects are somewhat unpredictable, aren't they, from new machinery? It can cause an expansion of an industry, but it can also cause its complete elimination and displacement, right, of an industry.
Right. So you have in mind that the horse and buggies go out of business because of the car.
Right.
Yeah. So Hazlitt, he doesn't. I mean, that's certainly one effect. But what he's really trying to focus in on is the even sillier fallacy of in an industry that benefits from the machinery, so that they still make the same product, but now they use machines to do it. But you're right. He makes the point that sometimes advocates on our side of this issue go too far, and they just stress the long-term net effects in general and how everyone must be richer per capita, which is obviously true. With machines, more stuff's getting produced, so obviously per person there's more stuff to be consumed, but it is possible that individual laborers, if you spent your whole life learning a trade and then a machine comes along that does your job, you might be worse off for a few years. Right. And so it's good that he dots all the I's and crosses all the T's and makes sure he catches all the
It's quite systematic, yeah. Mm-hmm. Now, a lot of this we can understand from our own work lives. In fact, probably everybody can understand it at some level because we've all benefited enormously in the last 15, 20 years. Actually, almost daily.
Sure.
There are new things that help us.
Right. I mean, it's gotten to the point now where the anti-capitalist criticism is, oh, give me a break. I want to just be able to go on vacation and not have my boss be able to get in touch with me, and I just could turn off all my pagers. Or as a consumer, I have too many choices, and you go into McDonald's and there's 16 different value menus. And so, now it's almost like even the people who hate capitalism can't with a straight face say it impoverished us. Now they have to say we're overwhelmed with all these choices and all these gadgets that don't really help us.
And yet, I'm sure you've had this experience of talking to people and the subject of computers and software, and it's always an interesting dinner time conversation. Come up, and there'll always be somebody that says something like, well, I really regret a lot of this in many ways because, we've just become this nation in which, unless you know how to use a computer, there's nothing for you to do. And there's lots of people who just cannot and will not do this. And what's going to become of them?
Right. And, at some point, there's always ways you can try to show, no, even anybody, even someone, like if you've seen it in the fast food restaurants now, like some of the terminals, they just have pictures of the value meals. And so, they really just do everything business needs to do to cater to any type of, human being of any sort. Like, how can we adapt to use this person to integrate him into the social nexus of cooperation. But you're right. Ultimately, if there is somebody that just refuses to learn, what if someone just said, I don't want to use language? What are you going to do about that? And is that a vexing social problem? Well, I don't know, but it's, this is all voluntary decisions happening, and if the great majority are benefiting, we're not forcing you to not use computers. We're saying we're going to use computers, and you're free to use them if you want to.
Doesn't it seem like you meet more and more people, though, that are very successful at what they do, but are doing something that they weren't trained to do at all in college? Doesn't it seem more and more common now?
I think so. I don't know historically what the difference would be, but certainly, yeah. I'm not doing exactly right now what I thought I was going to be doing. I thought I was going to be at a college, teaching classes, and I'm not doing that right now. But I love what I'm doing, and yeah, you're right. Plenty of people I talk to, it's almost a joke. I don't even ask people anymore, what's your major? Because I know that's more like just saying, what are your hobbies at this point? It has nothing to do. Now I ask people, do you know what you're going to do with your career? Even that's not the right phrase anymore, because that just makes it sound like, I'm going to go work for IBM for my life. And nobody thinks like that anymore.
Nobody thinks like that. But don't you have some sense, of course we weren't around, but don't you have some sense that sometime after World War II, there was this perception that, your life is really laid out for you. You go to school, you learn a particular trade, you land in that trade, and you work in that thing, you do the same thing until you retire and get the grandfather clock, and that's it.
Sure, yeah. I grew up in Rochester, New York, and that, I think its title was the imaging capital of the world, because it had IBM and Xerox and Kodak were headquartered there. And yeah, people would be, growing, in the 80s is when I started really becoming politically aware, and then the letters to the editor, because Kodak was downsizing, so was IBM. And all the letters were talking about how it used to be that, there was loyalty, and you put in your hours in the company, and they had your pension and everything, and now we're just outsourcing, and now it's all about the bottom line. And so, yeah, certainly people say that it used to be this understanding that when you went to work for IBM or Kodak, that was it, and there was an understanding.
And the pace of the technological changes seems to be growing. It's accelerating, is what I mean to say. And yet it makes life more interesting, doesn't it? Can you imagine doing the same darn thing? We live in a world of relentless change.
Oh, sure.
And I love it.
I do too, and it's partly my personality. I don't mean to say this too glibly, but I think I have attention deficit disorder, and I can't.
Oh, we all do.
Yeah, the idea of just doing one thing for 30 years just seems inconceivable to me. So you're right, and it's and this technological progress it is accelerating, and we just take for granted that every time we buy a new computer that's supposed to do things, and then something little. But then I do this too, and I get so mad and say, do computers even save time? And I get all frustrated because the Excel formula didn't get imported into Word properly when I was growing up. I mean, just to get a hard drive was like, oh wow, there's a hard drive? This is amazing. And, I upgrade to 640 RAM, kilobytes of RAM. This is amazing. And now, I have more than that in my phone. And it's, so it's really amazing.
What about the next chapter that is titled Spread the Word? What is a spread the word scheme? Is this an anachronism these days, or no?
No, I don't think it's an anachronism, because most of the examples. So the spread the work scheme is just the idea that there's a fixed amount of work to be done, and so it would be unfair. Left to their own devices, these greedy businessmen would have just picked the most efficient laborers, the ones that they could give the lowest wages to, and they would do all the work, and everyone else would be out of a job. And so we need to have the government or unions come in and put rules in place to spread this fixed amount of work around to make sure everyone gets some pay and gets some work, and that would allow there to be more consumer spending and things like that. So that's the idea. And no, most of the examples Hazlitt gives are things like federal rules on overtime pay. He said part of the motivation, the explicit motivation for that, when they put those rules into place, was we want to give businessmen an incentive not, if they have 80 hours of work to be done, don't give it all to the most productive guy. Give 40 hours to one person and 40 hours to somebody else.
So it wasn't about human rights. It was just a sort of a silly.
Right. Hazlitt clarified. He said some of those things were an issue, like prohibitions on child labor and things like that. He said he thinks a lot of the motivation was a sort of this is unseemly, but he said nobody thought working 50 hours a week was going to physically break someone's back, and that the precise quantitative amounts for some of these things were clearly and explicitly ideas of. During the Depression and what have you, we got to really spread the work around.
Involve as many people as possible in the production.
Right, and then he just goes through and quotes all these ridiculous union regulations, things that I know are still enforced today. Maybe not the specifics, but the idea that there needs to be the electrician on site to screw in a light bulb. I mean, really ridiculous things where someone can't do the work of someone else, or else you have to pay him an extra day's wages, and you have to pay the guy who should have done it. And just all these crazy things.
You encounter that in large cities even now. I mean, just absurd.
Right, yeah. I mean, even when I was growing up, I worked in a factory at Kodak for a while, and I used to hear horror stories about guys. I mean, they weren't ideological. They were just joking around listen to this crazy story about just things like, they had 2 more minutes left of work to do on this job, but it's lunchtime, we got to go to lunch.
Yeah,
and then the guy was saying, well, why don't we just finish this and be done with it? No. And then, so then that whole section of the factory was shut down for another 2 hours because they had to go to lunch and come back just to do 2 minutes of work. And if there weren't these official regulations, obviously.
So we live with these with the remnants of this fallacy, but is the fallacy itself still around? Do you hear it?
I guess I don't think I hear it as much now as Hazlitt seems to make it sound it being prevalent then. I mean, some of the other stuff in his book about the benefits of a tornado boosting GDP because now we have to rebuild. I mean, those sorts of things, the broken window fallacy, I see a lot more now. The spread the work idea, it's still embedded in union propaganda, but I haven't seen that being trumpeted too much.
I haven't asked you what's wrong with it. What's wrong with actually spread the work?
With the spread the work scheme? Yeah, it's
we're
good
just assuming that this is
right because we know it's wrong, but it is, and that's again just to plug Hazlitt's book.
Yeah.
The stuff's got to be wrong, but he just goes through and says, let's make sure we understand why it's wrong. And with this, he says, okay, so let's say the government or the union or what have you just sets up a rule where, okay, now there's a certain amount of people working, and why don't we say you have to work 75% of the hours you used to, and that's the rule. And he said there's 2 ways, 2 things that can happen. So if we allow the business to cut wages, and so that they're, the workers who used to be employed working so much now earn 75% in their paycheck. He said, well then, all you've done is they're giving some of their money to the people who now fill the gap in, and so it's not that society's richer and you're benefiting one group at the expense of the other. You're not helping labor because obviously the workers who now get their hours cut back are worse off.
Right.
And then he said, on the other hand, if you insist that let's cut back their hours, but you still have to give them the same gross paycheck every week, and then also decide what you want to do. If you want to hire more workers, well, then clearly that's going to cause unemployment, that you've in effect put in a wage control, and that you're forcing the employer to pay more per hour than he originally wanted to, and so that's going to cause them to hire fewer workers. And obviously, so in an attempt to help workers, you're just throwing people out of work. It would be no different from just saying, why don't you just increase pay by 25%? And we could think through why that wouldn't help workers in general.
Yeah.
So it's again, you just say in the original equilibrium before this intervention, things were the way they were for a certain reason. And even there, Hazlitt clarified that this is under the most generous assumptions, that really what happens is the people who are working the most are the most productive. And so if you arbitrarily say you can't work as much and give that job to somebody else, then the total amount of output drops, because now you're giving the work to people who aren't as efficient.
That's right. It's an example of government regulations creating people as some sort of acting as if all workers are homogeneous.
Right. Right.
And
in this, and then in the previous chapter too, the curse of machinery, he stresses over and over that one of the main things that's wrong with this is this idea that there's a set amount of work that needs to be done, and who's going to do it. When no, in general, if wages can adjust, you can hire as many people as want to work. And so then the issue is not these are the tasks to be done, who's going to do it. But no, different tasks can be done. I mean, labor's scarce, and you put workers into where they're most highly needed. And then if more machinery comes in, oh, great, now we can do more stuff. We can accomplish more things. And so you always channel workers to where they're needed most on the margin.
And this observation that there's always work to do isn't just an empirical observation of a certain time and a place, but it's always true, always and everywhere, isn't it?
Right, yeah. I mean, you could, I suppose, come up with crazy scenarios if there were 10 trillion people and someone would be, labor would no longer be scarce. But yeah, this is clearly, in any practical sense, there's always more work to be done. That it's the reason people stop working is because on the margin they say, you know what, my leisure's more important. It's not because there's absolutely nothing that human creativity in a pair of hands couldn't contribute to create more output that consumers would want. Yeah. That never happens.
Because we don't live in a utopia.
Right.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Murphy, for your wonderful talk.
Oh, thanks for having me.
This is Jeffrey Tucker with another installment in our continuing series of interviews with economists about this book, Economics in One Lesson. And it's my privilege to introduce Walter Block, who is the editor of the book. Actually, not editor, you just wrote the introduction, but certainly one of the top enthusiasts for Hazlitt's work.
Oh, yes.
And so the first chapter we're going to cover is Disbanding Troops and Bureaucrats, a particular problem in 1946, right? And the second one concerns this issue of full employment, which is a phrase we still hear today. So let's first talk about troops and bureaucrats. Maybe you can give some of the background behind Hazlitt's discussion.
Well, in 1946, I think the book came out in 46, so he might have written it in 45, I'm guessing, but maybe 44, late 44. Say it was 45, and he knew the war was just about over, or it was over, and now there were many, many foreign soldiers located in Europe, located in Asia, many, many of them in World War II. And they wanted more than anything else to come home, I'm sure, to establish families or to see their wives and kids who they hadn't seen for a while. And they were going to sort of inundate the U.S. with themselves. So there'd be many of them coming, and people were afraid. Would there be jobs enough for them? And I think that was the context under which Hazlitt was writing. And the fear would be that there wouldn't be jobs for them because, right now we have 1% unemployment or whatever it was, or 2% unemployment. And now you have several hundreds of thousands or even millions of people descending upon the U.S. all within a matter of weeks or months at the most. And maybe there wouldn't be enough jobs for them. But Hazlitt quite rightly set this aside or gave it the back of his hand as it deserves. The idea we have to address is what creates jobs in the first place. We have to get down into the nitty-gritty. And the reason we have jobs in the first place is because of scarcity. And what is scarcity? Scarcity means we have less than what we want. We have this much, we want that much. And that's where the jobs come from. And as long as there's unmet needs, as long as people want more stuff than they have, there'd be jobs not only for all the U.S. soldiers, but for a zillion Martians, or Chinese, or just anyone. Could come down to the U.S. or to the world or whatever and have jobs.
Perhaps it would be easier to understand if people understood that that Hazlitt is writing, and also not just in light of the Second World War, but also from the New Deal experience, where we had all these years where the government was trying to reduce the unemployment rate but couldn't, and the widespread perception that it was the war that solved the employment problem. Right?
Right. Well, Higgs has done a lot of good work on that. I mean, that was just silly. We certainly had unemployment problems. I mean, if you take millions of people and take them out of the labor force, of course the unemployment rates are going to look better. But I think the point needs to be made that I think we've said this before about Hazlitt, is that it could have been written yesterday.
Yeah.
Because right now we have soldiers in Iraq and Iran, and we have 800 military bases in 140 different countries.
Right.
And suppose Ron Paul won for president, and his first policy would bring the troops home. I don't know that there are as many troops nowadays in 2008 as there were in 45, 46, but there's quite a hunk of them.
Right.
In Germany and Korea, you name a country, there's probably a U.S. troop there. And if we were to bring them all now, it's the same situation as it was in 46.
But part of the fear, though, is that the people will have to be, I don't know if the word is retrained, but they would accept different kinds of jobs. Government jobs require different kinds of skills, especially in the military, than is required in the private sector. So that's part of the fear.
Well, you see, I think the main fear was not so much that they would have to switch from killing people to making cars or something like that. Yeah. The fear was that there just weren't any jobs, even if they were to switch. Now, you're quite right that the switching would take some time. People have to get allotted to the new slots. I can see that. But the fear that he was addressing in this chapter was that there wouldn't be enough jobs, even if they were retrained, because, there are millions of them coming.
Yeah.
Well, one way to look at it is that they come not only with arms, but with mouths.
Yeah. Okay.
And they'll be producing stuff that they'll be eating, or the additional amount that they produce, they'll be eating. But see, to look at that way is sort of a Keynesianish way to look at it, that what's really causing it is their mouths, demand. That's it's sort of backwards. First we have to produce, then we can eat.
Right.
It's sort of a basic premise that you can't eat first. Eating can't be the cause of things. It's rather the producing. And as long as we want more things than we have, there's jobs for them to do to create those things that we don't have. Now, there is one way out of that, and that is if we end scarcity. Lots of rock, as they say, but there are ways. I mean, one way to end scarcity is produce more, but it's very problematic because our eyes are bigger than our stomachs. No matter how much we produce, there's always something else we want. On the other hand, we could go the other route, the ascetic route, like Gandhi, where all you want is a diaper and some goat's milk, and that's it, although he did want the British out of India, which is, not nothing. But apart from that, so if you had a group of ascetics who didn't really want much of anything, well, then there wouldn't be jobs for them, but then there'd be no need for those jobs because we don't want the stuff.
Yeah.
So there's really no problem with the laissez-faire capitalism.
It occurs to me, too, that this does have an impact on the immigration question, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
The fear that the immigrants will come in and there won't be anywhere for them to work, or another related fear is that they will drive down wage rates for everybody else.
Well, this is a very complex subject, and as you know, there is division among libertarians. Hans Hoppe and Murray Rothbard take one view on immigration.
But not so much on the economic issues.
Oh,
right.
Not on the economics. Right. You're quite right. I stand corrected on that. Not on the economics. We all agree that there's no problem of creating jobs for immigrants, for soldiers, for Martians, for new babies.
Right.
who are
It's a similar
immigrating,
issue.
who are immigrating from Storkovia.
Yeah.
They come with storks. I don't know if you knew this, Jeff, but they come from this country called Storkovia, and storks bring them.
That's first I've heard of
And
that,
20 years later, you've heard about this. And 20 years later, or 15 years later, they need jobs too. And where do all these jobs come from? And the answer is they come from scarcity.
Yeah.
As long as we want more than we have, there'll be jobs for immigrants, there'll be jobs for anyone.
What about the fear of wage rates declining?
Well, we're now out of praxeology. We're into thymology.
Right.
And there will be, look, if say the immigration consists solely of physicists, well, there might be a case where physicists' wages would fall. Yeah. And if the wage consists of solely low-skilled people, well, then the wages of low-skilled people might fall. But even there, it's an empirical issue. It might be that economies of scale, even with physicists or low-wage people, might increase it. It depends upon how much capital there is. These are very, very empirically dirty questions.
In any case, everybody is aware that the rarer your skills are, the higher your pay tends to be, provided that your skills are more demanded in the market. So if people who do your thing are more prevalent, then you need to move on. And we do that in life anyway, don't we?
That's right. Look, what are we going to do? I mean, your daughter is now taking piano lessons.
Yeah.
So she's ruining the piano industry because she's lowering the wages of all pianists slightly.
Right. And by the way,
so what are we going to do? Forbid you?
Right. And why do we consider this to be such a terrible thing for a person to change? You know, how many of us? Well, I guess all of us have a variety of things we're interested in doing.
Right.
And if we find somebody who does what we're doing now just as well as us, and does it at the same wage rate, and does it even better, then it gives us an opportunity to move on and do something else. Why is that such a terrible thing?
No, I agree with you. Yeah. Hans Hoppe and I have an article co-authored where we say you have the right to own things, but you don't have the right to own the price of them.
Yeah.
Because the price of them is determined by all buyers and sellers, of the marginal buyer and the marginal seller.
Right.
So if you get an extra physicist or pianist, and the wages of physicists and pianists go down, tough.
Yeah.
You shouldn't enter the market if you're afraid of things, because you don't own the price. The price is determined by the market.
Tough, and also wonderful, because it gives you a chance to do something else, to seek out your highest value.
Well, you don't necessarily have to do something else. You could stay as a pianist or a physicist just at a lower wages, or if you don't like the wage, you go do something else.
Yeah.
So it's
really not a problem.
No.
And so a lot of the issues that Hazlitt's dealing with here are refuting fallacies that are generated from a mechanistic view of economics that doesn't look at economics from the point of view of human actors, but looks at these big aggregates working. And so one of these aggregates is the unemployment rate. And so there's this longing for so-called full employment. And that doesn't really mean, in the economics literature, it doesn't mean that everybody's working, does it?
Well, certainly not. I mean...
what is full employment?
Well, in this chapter, what I think Hazlitt is doing, the essence of this chapter is saying, look, we don't want full employment. What we want is full production.
Yeah.
We want as much as production as we can get, because, look, I think he has this... I forget where he has this story in which chapter, but I think it's in this chapter where he says, look, if you really wanted full employment, get rid of all the trains, and then put the stuff that goes on a train, say from Auburn to, or say from Atlanta to Chicago, a big long train of 500 cars. Each car has got tons of stuff in it. Put that on people's backs, 50 pounds to a person, and let them walk from Atlanta to Chicago. And then we'll have jobs not only for everyone in the United States, we'll have jobs for everyone who's ever lived, and for trillions of people. Because, and that way you'd have full employment. But everyone would be working on carrying stuff from Atlanta to Chicago. We'd have no food, we'd have no clothing, we'd have no medical care, we'd have nothing. So I think he's focusing us in the right direction. That full employment is bad. We don't want employment. We're against employment. Employment is a bad thing. Play is good. Employment is a bad thing. It's a necessary evil because we live in a world of scarcity, so we have to work in order to produce. But if I could press a button and say, look, no employment.
You just want to play forever.
And we just play, and stuff comes down from heaven like manna. You want a bicycle, you just sort of think a bicycle, you got one. You want lunch, you think about lunch and you have it. We don't want employment. Yeah. We accept unemployment unhappily because we're on the wrong side of the Garden of Eden. If we're in the Garden of Eden, there'd be no employment, there'd be play. Now, Mises makes the very good point that the ideal thing is to be paid to play. Like a basketball player or a singer who I assume enjoys it and they get paid. Or you and I have a job. Jeff, don't tell Lou, otherwise he won't pay us. But we're not working. If I can include you in here. We've never worked an inch of our lives here at the Mises Institute. Yeah. We are playing. We enjoy this. Sure. If we could afford to, we would do it for no pay.
Right.
We're having fun now.
Right.
We're playing. It's true we're being paid to play, which is the ideal, but not everyone can be paid to play because you got to take out the garbage, and not everyone likes dealing with garbage.
Right.
So we don't want employment, and we don't want full employment. We don't want unemployment, namely people who want a job and can't get it, but that's due to government.
Right.
That's very
What about
thing.
this idea that all unemployment in a free market is voluntary?
Absolutely. All unemployment,
Stick by that,
all unemployment in a free market situation is voluntary in the sense that you're demanding a higher wage than someone is willing to give you. Look, Lou invited me to speak. Suppose I said, sure, Lou, I'll come for $5 million.
Yeah.
And Lou would say, well, I'd love to have you, but $5 million is a little rich for our budget. I'd be unemployed. And my school, it doesn't pay me $5 million a year, and if I demanded $5 million, I'd be unemployed.
Yeah. That's a choice you would make.
Yes. On the other hand, if I was willing to work for $5 an hour, I'm sure I could get a lot of jobs washing cars or whatever.
Yeah.
The lower the salary I'm willing to take, the more likely I am to get employment.
Right. And this is one of the additional problems with minimum wage, is it puts a floor on people's ability to evaluate their contribution.
Yeah.
That they can make to a
You know, the analogy that I like to use sometimes with the minimum wage is that the skunk is a very weak animal, but it has a compensating differential, the smell, and if it didn't have that, it'd probably go extinct.
Yeah.
The porcupine is a very weak animal except for its quills, and if it didn't have that, it'd go extinct. The deer, too, except for its speed. These are very weak animals, but they have one little thing that keeps them alive. Well, very unskilled people, too, have a compensating differential, the ability to work for low wages, and then they can get a job.
Sure.
But the minimum wage is like taking away from a poor person the quills of the porcupine or the smell of the skunk or the speed of the deer. It's vicious, it's depraved, it's immoral, it's disgusting. The people who do that ought to be subject to the full extent of the law.
But here we are entering into another period where the unemployment data is on the rise, a little bit, right? We're seeing more evidence of this. And the policy tendency is to do exactly what you're suggesting is the worst thing.
We just had a rise in the minimum wage. Yeah. And we have another one scheduled, I think, up to $7.20 or something. Yeah. Something like that.
And there'll be other moves to try to pressure employers from firing workers, from laying people off, and so on and so on.
Welcome back to the Depression. That's what FDR tried to do, keep wages up artificially, and that's what caused the unemployment. If the wages would have been allowed to settle to their market levels, we still had a depression, and there were misallocations of resources in the 20s. There would have been a lot of problems. But the depression could have lasted 10 months instead of 15 years, or 18 years, or however you count it.
Well, and maybe we can say that Hazlitt hadn't written his book yet in the Great Depression, so maybe that's one factor. But he has written the book now, and so we have access to all this information. There's no excuse for repeating the same mistakes.
Well, Hazlitt hadn't written his book by 29, but Mises had written a book or two. So there was really no excuse. But the mainstream economists don't read Mises, so that's the explanation, I think.
Well, do you think it would assist in avoiding some of these terrible errors of the past for this book to be more widely circulated?
I used to be an anarchist, but I now believe in government. And government should have one function.
Yeah.
They don't call me Walter Moderate Block for nothing. And the one function of the government should be to make everyone read that book. And that's it. See, I'm very moderate. I believe in government, but, limited government. I'm not an extremist here. I'm a moderate. And they ought to make everyone read that bloody book.
Yeah.
And have a quiz on it. And if they don't pass the quiz, they read it again.
Would your law expire or be applied to every new generation?
Everyone.
Thank you very much, Dr. Block.
My pleasure.
I'm Jeffrey Tucker of the Mises Institute. I have with me Mark Thornton, also of the Mises Institute, and we're plowing through Economics in One Lesson to see what kind of lessons he offers and how they apply today. And today we're going to talk about trade. And then the headlines this morning is the news presented as a tremendous calamity to the world that the latest trade negotiations have broken down and everyone's in a panic. So maybe you could put this in some context.
Big surprise, right?
You mean politicians getting together can't get along?
Yes, exactly. Or that these trade talks would break down. I mean, all of these international agreements and trade talks have always broken down at certain points, and they take forever to get to their supposed goals. And so, a trade talk round can take years and years and years, and they periodically break down when the various interest groups are at loggerheads with one another. Yeah. It's not the politicians so much, but the interest groups that they're representing that break down. Yeah.
So, for example, in the third world, or the developing world, we have a very strong desire for exporting their products, and a lot of these products are being protected by tariffs in the developed world. So it's a matter of negotiating between those concerns.
Absolutely. So it is really the interest groups behind them. It's the interests of the exporters versus the domestic producers. It's the whole story that Hazlitt tells so well about what's really going on. It's the protectionism is supposed to protect particular jobs, and that's obvious and that's seen. But what is not seen behind the scenes, so to speak, is that so many people are being hurt. The consumer's being hurt, domestic industries are being hurt, and the whole protectionist scheme is a net loser for the economy.
Now you say domestic industries. You mean final producers of goods, right? Because there's many intermediate producers the final producers are the ones that are benefiting from these restrictions on imports. But there are many in between producers, wholesale manufacturers and things that are very much hurt by the tariffs on the goods that they use. I'm thinking, for example, of sugar, which is, am I right, it's still heavily protected?
It is very heavily protected. The U.S. sugar producers have been protected since the very beginning of the country. I think that was to bring Louisiana into the Union or something. And so they've always had protection. It's really economically irrational for much of the U.S. sugar production to take place. It has very destructive effects on the Florida ecology, and it makes sugar prices for all Americans so much more expensive.
How much more?
Several times.
Really? We would pay a third as much for sugar?
We pay, let's say, 3 times the world price of sugar.
Right. So we pay that much less.
If we could get rid of those restrictions and import sugar from Cuba, for example, the price of sugar for Americans would go down, and many Americans say, well, I don't really buy that much sugar, but in reality, you do. You buy sugar in so many products that you consume, all of the bakery goods and all of the candies and ice cream and soda pop and, right on down the list. Now, of course, the price is so high that they've come up with the high fructose corn syrup as a...
And that's been around for some years.
Yes. Since I think after World War II, they started working on that as a way of helping the corn producers, who seem to always need help as well. And so most of our products have been altered with taking the sugar out and putting the high fructose corn syrup in them.
Right.
And so Coca-Cola in the United States doesn't taste like real Coca-Cola as it's produced elsewhere around the world.
I have to go and buy this Mexican Coke, which in the import section of the grocery stores to get anything that tastes decent. I read a story the other day. I don't know if you bumped into this either, but that said that this corn syrup is actually much more fattening than sugar. Did you see that? So
and the story actually speculated that this has substantial impact on the average weight of the average person in the American population.
Yeah, it has. It's supposed to have an impact on obesity and insulin problems.
Yeah, there you go.
And now that is still being debated scientifically amongst that community. And of course, the corn producers are saying no, it doesn't have any effect. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
And other people are saying no, it's correlated with obesity and it's correlated with diabetes and all of those sorts of things. So scientifically, we haven't heard the final word on that. I think there's a lot to the story, though, and certainly the basic correlation is there. The more corn syrup we've been consuming, the heavier we've gotten as a nation in general. And I think the science of it is that the high fructose corn syrup doesn't satisfy you as quickly as sugar, and that the corn syrup is supposed to be more stored in your body rather than used directly.
Something like that. Right.
And so that's the theory behind this problem. But it's
the tariffs are ultimately behind this. I mean,
Yes.
that's what's remarkable about it.
the unintended consequences.
Yeah.
You know, economists can't necessarily spell all of these unintended consequences out at the very beginning, but we should all be aware that we can't imagine all these problems. We don't know everything that's going to happen behind the scenes, but it's something to consider anytime something like a tariff or a regulation is brought up is, wait a second, you've got these direct effects that's going to hurt consumers, that's going to make it more difficult, for unprotected industries to get land, labor, and capital. And then you're going to have all these diversions and unintended consequences. So watch out.
Right.
And that's what Hazlitt is telling us. Look at the unseen problems that have emerged in things like sugar and the softwood lumber tariffs and the steel tariffs of 2002.
That's right.
These all have wide-ranging effects on the economy, and they're all negative.
Okay, now explain this. Every president that I can remember in my lifetime has said that free trade is a wonderful thing. I'm talking about U.S. president, right? Free trade is a wonderful thing. We have to back this wonderful trade agreement. We must just get behind it. Mm-hmm. And anybody who says otherwise is just backwards and uninformed. So there seems to be a big gap between the practice and what the politicians are preaching.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, no U.S. president that I can think of was actually for free trade.
Yeah.
That they would actually say unilaterally disarm our weapons of economic protectionism, which is what free trade is. That's what Richard Cobden advocated. That's what Frederick Bastiat advocated. That's what Henry Hazlitt advocated, is unilateral economic disarmament. Not negotiated international agreements. There's severe problems with international negotiated agreements. There's no problems with free trade. You just unilaterally lower your barriers, lower your restrictions, and trade emerges on its own. International agreements break down, and when they do, they can lead to things like war. Okay, so Europe went through this in the 19th century, where through bilateral agreements and then multilateral agreements, they all reduced their tariffs in the 19th century, but that led to internal contradictions within that system that ultimately broke out in hostility and was one of the ingredients leading up to World War I. So, the idea that we can negotiate our way to free trade is ridiculous. I mean, we can get some freer trade through those things, but the long run consequences are very dangerous.
Right. Then you have these boards that are set up to arbitrate disputes, and now why wouldn't those lead to more peaceful? So you don't have to turn to war; you have to turn to these arbitration panels. No.
Well, I mean, that's where the conflict arises, is with these panels and these organizations. Yeah. That's where the infighting comes to impasses. And things break down, just as this trade talks have broken down. Hopefully this breakdown will not result in any kind of war, but you can imagine economic circumstances 10, 15 years from now where trading negotiations between the United States and China and other parts of the world, the Middle East, that could come to great impasses that result in actual armed conflict as well.
So when you talk about free trade, you're really not talking about the World Trade Organization?
No,
or
absolutely not.
No.
There are aspects of freer trade within these organizations, such as the right of developing countries to import textiles and garments and clothing into the United States without any barriers. So there is some freer trade, and of course the lowering of those barriers helped American consumers. They had a very negative effect here in Alabama. We lost all of our textile mills here in the state of Alabama, but look what happened. We lost our steel mills and our textile mills, and what were they replaced with? They were replaced with automobiles, finance, high-tech, healthcare. And so when I ask some of my fellow citizens here in Alabama, would you rather that the population be working in textile mills or automobile plants? Would you rather have them working in iron mills or in finance and things of that nature, or healthcare? And of course, they always say, well, of course we'd rather have these higher paying, more sophisticated jobs for our population. So they can see the benefits after the fact, but up front, everybody was totally against all this relaxation of protectionism.
Another thing about these negotiations, it's very interesting because what is the U.S. position on these within these negotiations? Usually, it has something to do with if we're going to lower our tariffs, then you've got to accept what our policies that we're going to impose on you, such as IP, intellectual property recognition, so that American music manufacturers or something can crack down on pirated DVDs or whatever. Another one of these labor regulations and environmental restrictions that the U.S. is advocating that these other countries pick up. They can hardly afford them, right?
Right. They absolutely can't afford them. They can't, stop the IP problem. And so, those are going to be part of the impasse that it has been developing, is developing, and probably can only get worse. Really, there's nothing to suggest that these countries can comply with our labor regulations or our minimum wage law or anything like that.
Although American labor unions would love that, right?
Absolutely.
And why? Because they believe in the rights of workers all over the world?
I'm afraid not, Mr. Tucker. And that's why the unions are supposed to be, supposedly financing some of this anti-globalism groups around, that protest globalism, because they want the left-wing agenda of labor regulations and so forth to be more prominent and be a definitive part of the global project, so to speak.
Raise the cost of the competition.
Right.
That's the game, right?
That is the game.
Yeah. Right.
Or take a cut in the case of intellectual property. Take a cut of the revenue of foreign producers, who are otherwise able to produce and sell their products at a much lower price.
Okay. Well, this is a huge racket. Now, this topic is frustrating for you as an economist, isn't it? Because it's been explained now for centuries, and yet we still somehow don't get it, right?
Oh, yeah. If you read Hazlitt's chapter on, who gets protected, he starts off with a very frustrating discussion about, we've known all this. We don't need to be talking about the finer points of economic theory. We know the basics about tariffs and protectionism since at least the time of Adam Smith, and that this is the biggest step forward that we could take. We could just decide to become free trade, and it would be the biggest benefit to the economy that we could possibly do. And so there's a tremendous amount of frustration on the part of Hazlitt and myself and all the other Austrian economists about, just the common sense of free trade.
Yeah. So, what do you suppose is the missing ingredient? What's missing? Why can't we get from here to there, from our current protectionist environment to a world of free trade?
Well, of course, the special interest groups that benefit from these individual free trades have advocates who are paid large amounts of money to lobby Congress and other groups. And what we need to oppose that is the wide-ranging recognition of the benefits of free trade, and that people understand what free trade is, unilateral, and what it is not, which is these groups and these organizations and these agreements. And to proceed along those lines, which is far more efficient, which is far faster, and it's less likely to result in any kind of conflict between nations. And then eventually, once you go through a very short period of adjustment, like we did here in Alabama through the late 1980s and early 1990s, and all of a sudden, we're at a much better economic position. Yeah. And, people are happy with the outcome that they feared to begin with.
Wouldn't it set a wonderful example for the world, too?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's no question. I mean, you think about Cuba and Florida, where Florida is destroying the Everglades and its ecology in order to produce sugar. And Cuba, people are, on starving and they have no access to any kind of economy at all. And if we could just open up the free trade there, open up the door between Cuba and Florida, it would solve Florida's problem, its ecological problem, its water problem, and so on and so forth. Cuba would be a much more prosperous country, and all that takes is the will to do it.
And we would consume less corn syrup and more sugar, and we'd all be thin. Right? Or something like that.
Well, all the benefits start rolling out, all the unintended consequences start being rolled back. It's a wonderful process, and I hope we start it real soon.
Well, thanks so much for explaining this to us, Dr. Thornton.
This is Jeffrey Tucker. Again, I'm here with yet another economist to talk about our new edition of Economics in One Lesson. We're covering 2 more chapters. The economist in question is Peter Klein. Welcome, Peter.
Thank you, Jeff. It's great to be here.
And the 2 chapters we're talking about, well, the first one begins with the title, Parity Prices.
Right.
Parity prices. I haven't heard this term in modern journalism anymore. What's up with this?
Right. This is a term that I guess it's a little bit archaic. You still see it in the technical economics literature, what they call purchasing power parity. Parity just meaning equality or sameness. So the concern that Hazlitt was dealing with in the 1940s is the worry that certain groups, farmers, for example, would lose purchasing power if the prices of the goods and services that they produce, commodities, for example, did not maintain their parity from year to year. So sort of a general, the concern Hazlitt's dealing with is the fear that prices will fall and that therefore sellers of those commodities will be harmed and that that will have negative effects on other sectors of the economy and so on. So it's basically a plea to keep prices up.
I see. So, well, it turns out to not be that much of a consideration anymore, partly because of inflation, right?
Exactly. We don't worry too much about falling prices.
Right.
Where we do see prices falling in industries like telecommunications, computers, of course we think it's a great thing. I mean, think of what a personal computer cost in 1980 or 1985 compared to what you got, $2,000, $2,500, $3,000 for something that, doesn't have the computing power of the cheapest cell phone today. And you can get a PC for $500 today. That's, of course, vastly greater than anything you could have gotten in 1980. Hazlitt actually uses a numerical example like that with automobiles and shows how the sort of the real cost of producing automobiles has fallen, and how we would think it was a horrible thing if we had to pay in today's dollars the equivalent of what we paid for a Model T Ford and to get that kind of quality, because we simply wouldn't pay for that quality today. So in general, prices falling is a good thing. It means an increase in productivity.
So that I understand the argument concerning purchasing power is slightly different from the point that
it's bad for the industry for prices to fall, because it is difficult to do business under falling price conditions.
That's right.
So talk first about this purchasing power point. What does it mean?
Right. What he has in mind is the idea that a particular group in society, let's say that I am in the plumbing business, and let's say that for some reason the demand for plumbing services falls, and the market price of plumbing services goes down. I, as a plumber, have a hard time making ends meet. In general, you might say, well, that's a sad thing, Peter. We're sorry for you. Maybe you should consider another line of work. But I, as a plumber, and my plumber friends might go to the States, I go to the American people, and I say, pity the plight of the poor plumbers. Wow, that takes a lot of alliteration. And, if we don't have plumbers, then, society can't get by without plumbing, and we're a vital part of the American system, and so on.
Your spending habits, or just a critical link in
our existence, and also our spending. In other words, if the plumbers go out of business, then they won't be spending money on the goods and services the plumbers buy, and there'll be some sort of ripple effect throughout the whole economy. So essentially, it ends up being a kind of protectionist argument. And it's interesting that even though this term, where we see the term parity as in purchasing power parity, where that appears today, it's more in the international trade and macroeconomics literature. I mean, this is in a series of chapters in which Hazlitt is talking about different kinds of protectionism, special interest group politics, and he has in particular groups like agricultural producers in mind, that the call for agricultural producers to use government policy to keep prices from falling is just another form of special privilege for one particular group. A politically connected group.
I must say that when you're presenting the argument, it's not inherently implausible, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, it's absolutely true that when plumbers or farmers, let's say, are economically successful and doing well, they have money to spend on other goods and services, and there are certainly positive effects throughout the economy. But remember, there's sort of there's a difference between the overall condition of the economy and the condition of one particular sector. And if we use government policy to keep prices artificially high for farmers, well, that means higher prices that consumers pay for food, less money that those consumers have to spend on goods and services, and so on. It's really just, it all goes back to the basic lesson of the book, the broken window fallacy. The argument that if we don't protect the farmers, the economy will collapse is no different from the argument that what's good for one particular piece of the economy is necessarily good for all of it. It's the broken window all over again.
It's also interesting, isn't it, that so much of this, I don't know if you would call it Keynesian macroeconomic theorizing or whatever it is behind there. It's partially Keynesian, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Good out of the experience of the Great Depression, when it was widely believed that the falling prices were causing...
No, that's absolutely right. And I mean, it makes sense in a sort of common sense, intuitive way. If I'm a business person, and the prices, and I can't get a high price for the products that I sell, well, clearly that's bad for me. And that's, I'm in poor economic shape if I can't get a high price for the things that I want to exchange on the market. But it doesn't follow from that it's not the fact that prices are falling for my goods and services that is the cause of, some sort of general economic, economic problems, right? I mean, the falling prices are a result of, in this case, falling demand for the services of plumbers, or the commodities produced by farmers, or the salaries, services of economics professors, or whatever it might be. So there's a confusion of cause and effect.
And, it's interesting, too, how what's behind this macroeconomic theorizing is contrary to the interest of consumers, because as consumers, you always want to pay a lower price.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
That's right. And we're all producers and consumers in a sense. And it's just like any other, a tariff to protect the steel industry, for example. If you look only at the steel industry, it looks like, wow, higher prices for steel, higher profits, they can pay their workers more, and so on and so forth.
Many people made that mistake.
Exactly. And you forget about the fact that all the users of steel are paying higher prices, and that those effects, essentially, and it's not just that they cancel each other out and are neutral, but the effects of the protectionist policy are actually harmful in terms of distorting the allocation of resources throughout the economy, directing resources artificially toward one particular sector and away from others, which is not in the according to the wishes of consumers as they spend.
Say, would this be an example of this fallacy at work? The argument that Walmart shouldn't come to a city, come to a community, because look what happens. the local merchants.
Absolutely.
Okay, so it's a version of the same kind of argument. They'll have to lower the prices, and we'll be able to make a profit, and they have to go out of business, and Walmart takes it.
That's right. And remember, Hazlitt's one lesson that you have to see the whole, the whole story, the whole part, and the whole system, and not just one part. Yeah. And of course, if we look at a mom and pop business that cannot compete with a more efficient, more effective, more productive Walmart, of course, it's sad for that mom and pop industry. But if we stop the analysis there, we've lost the most important part, right? Namely that everybody else is actually much better off with the presence of a store like Walmart.
Right, evidently so, right? Or else they wouldn't go.
That's absolutely right.
They wouldn't go, and Walmart would go out of business.
It's interesting that you mentioned Walmart because the next chapter in the book is titled Saving the X Industry.
So the themes tie together.
Exactly, same theme where he gives lots of examples of industries, steel, automobiles, whatever it is that claim to have a special standing in the economy. They're particularly important for economic prosperity. If this industry were to fall, well, then the dominoes will begin to collapse.
Or whatever. Shoes, what would we be without shoes?
And of course, it's very cleverly named Saving the X Industry because you can fill in the blank any way you like. Today, of course, it's the banking industry and the home mortgage industry. And oh my goodness, if we let Freddie Mac and Fannie Mae collapse, well, then something else will collapse, and then the whole financial system will go under. If we don't do something to stop foreclosures, all these people who who lose their homes due to foreclosure, their economic condition will lead to these spillover effects to sort of the rest of the economy and so on. It was the same thing after 9/11. Remember, the airline industry and the insurance industry.
We won't be able to visit our families across over on the West Coast.
It's the same thing. And the point is, every argument like that ultimately boils down to some kind of special pleading why the state should favor my industry as opposed to other industries at the expense of other industries in the economy. The reason I had a seg to that from Walmart is because I was thinking about this argument. People who say we need to protect homeowners, we need to protect banks, we need to protect particular investment firms that bet heavily on these mortgage-backed securities and made the wrong bet. Walmart is a great example of a company that, to the mass of consumers that it serves is, of course, heroic, but to most intellectuals, professors, journalists, and so on is a sort of symptom of the evil of capitalism driving out the little guy and so on. But I think, suppose Walmart were to be in financial hardship, suppose Walmart were to declare bankruptcy or be on the verge of collapse. Do you think the same members of the intelligentsia would be crying for the government to prop up Walmart, to save Walmart? Because it really is true. Think of all these small rural communities that are served by Walmart and little else. If Walmart were to disappear right away, masses of people throughout rural America and elsewhere in the world would be much worse off. But I bet you wouldn't see the calls for Walmart because Walmart is so
5 or 10 years, right?
politically. Oh yeah, it could be. Certainly could be. And of course, there is there are extra economic arguments typically brought into these kind of saving the X industry stories with steel or automobiles. Oh, people might make a national defense argument. If we don't have a healthy U.S. steel industry, if we buy all our steel from Korea or from Japan, well, my gosh, what happens if the East Asians declare war on us? We won't have enough steel to build tanks and so on. In the case of agriculture, people say, well, agriculture is special somehow. It's part of the fabric of American society, the Jeffersonian ideal. We need to have this sector has to be strong. It's important to have a strong agricultural sector, even if it's not purely for economic reasons, but just for sort of moral, spiritual, inspirational reasons. In fact, you do see that policy much more explicit in Europe, for example, where agriculture having beautiful little communities. It's like rural France. It's like Disneyland, right? So the people who live in Paris and the big cities want to have the beautiful countryside to escape to, and they want to see a guy with a plow or a pitchfork, the yeoman farmer in his little cottage, because it's part of the scenery. It looks pretty. It's not a purely economic story. It's sort of a political and social story as well.
And it's why they keep out these big stores, big discount stores.
Absolutely, would ruin the landscape. That's exactly right.
But meanwhile, unemployment's very high.
I've actually heard about a case where a place in Europe where they're popular biking routes, and where some local governments have put up fake cows and horses up on the hillside so that when the bikers are going by, they look off and they see this pastoral scene with the horses and the cows and so on, but they're actually just made of cardboard and they're off in the distance on the mountaintop to make it look more romantic.
A burgeoning local industry to manufacture of cardboard cows?
You might think they would wonder at some point why the cows never move.
Yeah, right. Can I ask you something about the whole question of falling prices and doing business under falling prices? You mentioned the computer industry earlier. Mm-hmm. What are the kinds of challenges that an industry faces under these conditions?
Sure. Well, it's extremely difficult because you not only have prices falling, but just the fact that prices are so uncertain. Right? It's pretty it's much easier to run to be in business as an undertaker, where demand and supply conditions are relatively stable, than it is to be in a rapidly changing industry like IT, where there's all sorts of technological innovations coming down the road. On the other hand, we have to keep in mind when we talk about falling prices in the computer business, for example, it's not just the price of the PCs that Dell or Apple or HP or Lenovo sell to consumers, but also the prices of the intermediate products that go into the computer are falling as well.
For the final manufacturers are paying less for the products.
Absolutely.
Right.
So
Okay.
it would be bad for Dell if output prices were falling, but input prices remained the same.
Right.
Then Dell would be in an increased, there would be a squeeze. But of course, the prices of memory and hard drives and the LCD screens, right? All of the components, those prices are falling
But you have
too.
to be very careful about inventory, then, don't you?
Oh, absolutely.
Is that one of the factors that it's just an extreme attachment to the whole question of you have to just have very good short-term forecasts?
No, I think that's exactly right. Because think of if the manufacturer were to stock up on a bunch of components when the component prices are high and not use them until the price of the computers has fallen, it would be a difficult thing. But that's why we see in industries like that a move towards the sort of just-in-time manufacturing model where inventories are kept very low, precisely because there's so much price volatility. And of course, Jeff, remember there are other things that businesses can do. They can try to reduce price variability through long-term contracts with suppliers and with customers. So, companies like computer companies like Dell, for example, most of their business is not simply sales to computers, but sales to large companies, government agencies, universities, and so on. And they often have long-term contracts with those clients, which can, where some prices can be specified ahead of time. So, of course, doing business in a highly volatile sector of the economy is challenging, but there are many opportunities there as well.
It leads to increases in efficiency, doesn't it?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
We as consumers, we just sit and enjoy the ride, right? Ultimately, it doesn't matter to me a lot whether it's Dell or Lenovo or HP or whoever manufacturing the computer. My goodness, look at all the goodies I get to consume. They're competing with each other, dog eat dog, in a highly competitive world in which their margins are getting smaller and smaller. But hey, it's great for the consumer.
And it must be good for them ultimately, or else they could easily leave the industry, right? There's nothing forcing anybody to be a computer manufacturer.
That's exactly
And the
right.
same is true in other industries. Agriculture,
Sure.
it would survive under falling prices.
An additional problem with the argument for propping up Industry X is that it sort of locks us into, the way the economy is at the point that legislation comes into place, where we may wish things to be completely different.
Right.
So the obvious example that I use in class all the time is imagine that, if we had, when the automobile first came around, if we had special protection for horseshoe manufacturers, blacksmiths, the people who scooped up after the animals in the roads and so on, sure, it would be good for people who are employed in that sector, but how would you like to be riding a horse and driving a horse-drawn buggy today as opposed to the automobile? The point is with the computer business, again, think how rapidly things change. Who knows what kind of computing devices the market will give us in 20 years, 10 years, even 5 years, if we were to try to sort of keep things the way they are right now to have some short-term stability, we might lose out in a huge way in the long term.
So how would you speculate what would happen to the housing industry if prices just continue to fall? What happens?
Well, look, there are a couple different possibilities. If sort of current, if people's preferences for how they live and where they live and so on were to remain basically unchanged, there's going to be a demand for housing, right? Now, on the margin, some people who own their own homes might prefer to own condominiums or to be renters and so on. But, it isn't the case that we're all going to start living in these massive, collective apartment buildings where we live in family units of 1,000 people each or something like that. So presumably the sort of rough distribution of people between living in single-family homes versus apartments and so on probably wouldn't change that much. But there might be different entrepreneurs building the houses, different financial institutions funding the houses, and there might be different
financial terms.
Might be different people living in the houses.
Yeah.
Sure. I mean, it's one thing that is so frustrating about the current mortgage bailout is how grossly unfair it is to people of modest means who didn't buy a house because they thought it was more financially prudent to rent, for example, and their friends of equal means who sort of recklessly purchased a house that they couldn't afford and signed an adjustable rate mortgage they didn't really understand and are now getting a subsidy check or are getting some kind of protection to bail them out. It's really unfair to the person who didn't make that choice.
Right.
So we would see some differences, to be sure.
And the renter who's out on the housing market
that's right.
would probably appreciate housing prices that fallen a little bit more already.
I mean, Jeff, you could turn the question around the other way and say to the person who advocates the subsidy, the protection, the bailout, essentially they're arguing that market forces don't work in this particular case.
Right.
That, just as we had a horse and buggy industry at one point and now we have an automobile industry, and there was a transition as technology changed, as new resources became available, as consumer preferences changed, we had a rapid, sudden, dynamic shift from having one type of industry being prominent to having a new industry being prominent. Same thing with computers and aerospace and lots of other industries that we see. Well, if that's a bad thing, if we don't think the market can adequately meet people's demands and can adequately adjust for changes for technological breakthroughs, well, I think the burden of proof ought to be on the critic to explain why the market doesn't work in that case. Yeah. Why can't the free market handle housing? Why can't the free market handle food? Why can't the free market handle automobiles or clothing or computers or anything else? Instead, usually the burden is put on the defender of the market to explain why this regulation isn't needed. Right. Well, okay, fine. That's the world we're in. That's the game we have to play. But sometimes it's fun to turn it around and put the shoe on the other foot.
And isn't it interesting how we're somehow only now paying the price for this policy that began sometime after World War II?
Absolutely.
Isn't it remarkable?
And again, I think there's an extra economic aspect to this too. There's this sort of romantic notion of the post-war baby boom notion of the house and the white picket fence and the 2.5 kids in the car in the garage and so on. And of course, that's a wonderful thing. And there's nothing wrong with having that sort of vision, each of us individually having one vision or another of how we want to live. But the use of government policy to promote one particular lifestyle, one particular housing choice doesn't seem to be justified.
And when Hazlitt speaks about thinking about the long-term implications of policies, in this case, the long term is something like 60 years.
That's absolutely right.
Remarkable.
That's right. And again, we have to. That's another, as you do well to remind us that Hazlitt, when he talks about looking at the big picture, it's the overall economy at any one point in time, and also looking at the long run consequences. Again, think of housing. Sort of the legislation that's just working its way through Congress now, right? This massive bailout policy.
Trillions.
People, they're not at all looking at the obvious long-run consequence of encouraging irresponsible behavior. I don't know what else to call it. Anytime you have an industry like housing, airlines, automobiles, whatever it is that is perceived to be, quote, too big to fail, anytime there's an implicit government guarantee to protect you if you run into hard times, well, of course that's going to affect behavior, right? The economists call that moral hazard, but in layman's terms, we would call it, irresponsible or inappropriate behavior. Right. Sure, of course, if I know my downside is covered, I'm going to engage in a lot more risky behavior than I would if I had to bear the consequences of my own action. And people talking about this legislation today, most of its advocates are completely ignoring these long-run consequences of encouraging malinvestment in the future, because the taxpayer is always going to come and pick up the tab.
Well, we've got the solution. Read the book.
Absolutely. Right? Highly recommend it to all of your viewers.
Thank you for explaining all this to us, Peter.
My pleasure. Great to be with you, Jeff.
Well, this is Jeffrey Tucker. I'm here again with another installment in our series on Economics in One Lesson. We're going chapter by chapter. And this morning we have Guido Hulsmann, the author of Mises, The Last Night of Liberalism. So it's a great pleasure to have you, Guido.
It's a great pleasure to be with you, Jeffrey.
And so we're talking this morning about how the price system works. And it's always occurred to me that this is the most underrated of all market institutions, the price system. Hardly anybody really understands it. And yet we use it every day, right?
That is true, and Hazlitt explains very well that it's not really, not only how prices work, but the interrelations that exist between prices, and in particular between industries. If one industry flourishes, for each single industry, its fate depends on the relationship between its cost expenditure and its selling receipts, which must be good. But precisely the crucial point is that both costs and selling receipts are interdependent with the costs and selling receipts of all other industries.
How's that?
So if one industry flourishes, for example, because there's an additional consumer demand for it, so there's additional spending going on this industry, so it can expand its activities, it means that consumers who spend more money on this must necessarily spend less money elsewhere in the economic system. So other industries experience a decrease in their selling receipts relative to cost expenditure, so their activity shrinks. It is, of course, possible to have the general growth of all industries, which results from savings, as Hazlitt explains in other chapters of his book.
Right.
But the crucial point is that we, in order to properly understand the economic system, we always need to keep in mind the interdependencies that exist between all parts of the economic system and not just look on one part of it.
Yes. Well, can you give us a definition of the word price? What is a price?
A price is an exchange ratio in which two quantities of goods are being exchanged, and one of them is money.
Okay. And can we imagine a world without prices?
Sure, we can imagine a world without prices. We can imagine a world of individuals living in isolation from one another and just caring for their own business, not cooperate with other people, never exchange a single bit. But of course, such a world could not be very populous, because people would live in great misery, as we can understand.
If they live at all.
If they live at all. Yeah, well, in some particularly well-endowed areas, Africa, Latin America, and so on, some parts of the United States, where nature is generous and so on, there people could live off just the fruits hanging on the trees and so on, so live a hand-into-the-mouth existence. But most other areas of the world where precisely Western civilization has emerged, Europe, Northern America, and so on, it would not be possible to live such a life.
So any kind of extended or complicated form of human cooperation requires prices.
Does require price, right? The only other logical alternative would be to imagine that we organize a division of labor by a central plan. That has been tried out in the Soviet Union and its satellites, and as economic theory, Ludwig von Mises' theory, has explained, and as historical experience has shown, this doesn't work.
Who makes prices?
People exchanging on the market. Every single one. You go to a bakery shop and pay a bread, you create a price.
Who creates the price? The consumer?
It's the consumer and the seller. So
And
the price is never just fixed by one person. Sometimes we say it's a colloquial way of speaking. There's some price fixing going on by the companies, which means in practice that the companies say, well, we will not sell our commodity at any other price but this one. But then, of course, that by itself does not yet give them the opportunity to really exchange it. Only if they find customers who are willing to pay this, so who agree with this price, then the price comes into being. I could say, well, I set up a shoe factory and say, well, my shoes are so nice. I mean, their price is $1 million. Okay. And that's not yet the price. It's just a slip of paper that I attach to my shoes, and it says $1 million. But that's not a price. A price comes into being once one appreciative gentleman, such as yourself, for example, pops into my shop and then actually gives me $1 million for the shoes, which I hope very much.
So the price is established in real exchange. It has to actually happen.
Yes.
Otherwise, it is what? It's an offer, or it's a
just
proposal.
hot air.
Hot air. Now, I was at the bakery a couple of days ago, and there was a sign that said, look, we very much regret that we've had to go up slightly on our prices. And I thought that was intriguing, because, of course, the bakery doesn't really want to go up on its prices. It wants more revenue.
Yes.
But it knows that any increase in price causes fewer of its goods to be sold.
Yeah. So you can interpret this sign in various ways. They might actually regret themselves. We regret ourselves very much to have to increase our prices to still have a margin as compared to our costs. And then they cannot be sure that they still will have enough business to create them some profit.
Yeah. And consumers, of course, always and everywhere want to pay how much for all of their goods and services?
Excuse me?
How much do consumers want to pay?
Well, we cannot generalize this. The fundamental fact is that consumers have to choose between different items that they would like to buy, shoes and clothing and food stuff, and they have to pay for housing and so on. And the price that they are ready to pay for any one item, of course, depends on the prices they have to pay for other things.
Well, I recall I was once buying a car, and this car salesman said to me, well, how much do you want to pay for this car? And my answer was, it was a very obvious answer, 0. Right?
Good answer. It might have reminded him of some essentials of economics.
And I was perfectly aware that he wanted to charge $1 billion for this car.
Yes.
So the problem was finding something in between.
So you had a good laugh, and then you got to the matter.
I guess that's it.
Yeah.
Now, what about this idea? You'd already mentioned central planning, but why can't an agency set a price? Why can't some external third party coercively just attach a price to a particular good or service?
Well, they can of course say, well, this object, this commodity may only be exchanged at this or that rate, and you may call this a price. I think we would have to make the distinction between a market price and a fiat price. Okay. So why doesn't this work for all goods? Well, precisely because all goods are interdependent with one another, and their proper relationship cannot be determined by purely theoretical means. That's a very important insight that comes from Austrian economics. Mm-hmm. It's not an engineering problem where we have a certain number of variables and then you plug this into a model and you get a certain result.
I see.
Because in human action we have the fundamental problem of anticipating future conditions.
Yeah.
Most of our markets are not actually markets for consumer goods, but are markets for producer goods. So we're talking here about the cost side of production in relation to consumer goods industries. But of course, so the producer goods markets are, let's say, 80% of the economy. Consumer goods markets are just about 20%.
Yeah.
Now, the prices for producer goods have to be determined in regard to what you expect to be the case in the future.
Yes, right.
So ultimately, it's a judgment that we have to make on the future. We do not have a scientific model that would allow us to predict or to determine exactly the future.
Now, there are certain conventions, aren't there, in the business world about what a price will be. You calculate all your costs and you figure out what kind of margin revenue you need, and what kind of margin of revenue you need to make this continue to be profitable, and you set it. And that's a convention, right?
You can call it that way. It's a practice that is informed by business schools, for example, standard teaching economics and so on.
Or even just if you're just a regular businessman.
Yes. But again, it's not accounting that gives you the proper price. Account is the other way around. The proper way to evaluate the assets that you have on your balance sheet is to first look what is the monetary value of the product that can be generated with the help of these assets in the future. Now, this judgment is just that. It's a judgment. It's not something that results from a scientific inquiry, but it's your good guess as an entrepreneur. It's your bet on the future. Now, precisely because we have no possibility to do this with a mathematical model, but because we have to bet, there's only one way to make this betting process responsible, namely by creating property rights and by making sure that the consequences of a bad choice fall back on the person who makes it.
Yeah. Okay. Now, you mentioned fiat prices versus market prices.
Yes.
That's very interesting.
Yeah.
Now, if a government agency, for example, the post office, well, let's pick a different one. Let's say you have a housing agency that's building houses and putting them on the market, and they use what they consider to be a business convention to establish what their prices are. You know, they might observe, well, the housing industry tends to buy things at this price and sell things at this price, and we'll just do the same thing. But you're saying that really ultimately is an arbitrary judgment.
Well, if they impose these supposed exchange ratios on the entire industry, whatever the particular conditions are, yes, that would be an improper way of handling.
And then what happens?
Well, then we get to the chapter in which Hazlitt deals with price controls. Right? If the price is set arbitrarily at a level different from the level it would attain in the free market exchange economy, then you get surpluses and shortages.
What is meant by this idea that all prices are past prices?
Well, it means that as long as we do not actually perform the exchange, we do not know what the price is. So, and then, of course, as soon as we know the price, well, it's a past price. We go to in the bakery shop and you buy the bread for $1. Only once you've actually paid the price and got the bread, you know what the price for the bread is, and then it's of course already a past price.
Yeah.
Let me mention also in this context that what businessmen are most concerned about is not necessarily the price; it's the total selling proceeds and the total cost expenditure.
Right.
So we should not forget that, of course, the price is relevant because it determines also the quantities that are being exchanged. What the businessman is mainly interested in is the volume generated as compared to the volume that he needs to expand.
And this is true whether it's a medium-sized business, a huge business, or a lemonade stand.
We have a true economic principle.
Right.
Yeah.
It's the same thing no matter what size the
exactly.
business is. And in this sense, the bigger business has no real advantage, does it?
No.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, ultimately, it's just a matter of you're just adding more zeros onto the same problem.
Yes.
Which is trying to make...
The problem is always to properly anticipate what is the total selling proceed that you can realize with a given investment. And then in relation to this, go on the market and try and see whether you can buy the factors of production necessary to bring this result about. Hire the proper workers, rent the right office space at the right location, and so on.
Now, Hazlitt wrote this chapter, 1946, which wasn't too many years. Well, let's say it was before Hayek's work on prices, and it was after Mises's detailed work on economic calculation. So would you say that Hazlitt's presentation of these chapters is based on a Misesian perspective of prices?
Hayek published his famous article on the use of knowledge in society in 1945, which was a year before the publication, first publication of Hazlitt's essay. So you could say that this might have had an impact, especially since he knew, of course, Hayek.
Yes.
At least by correspondence. Hayek actually did come to the US for the first time in 1945, I believe, to promote his book, The Road to Serfdom. Or in 1946, I don't remember very well. So, I mean, their personal contact was not very frequent, not very strong. So probably Mises had a much more definite impact on his thinking. Again, if you look at this chapter, how price determines the economy, it's very Böhm-Bawerkian, right? It's the great subject of Böhm-Bawerk's Capital and Interest, a great treatise, Capital and Interest, in which he stresses these points. The great contribution of Böhm-Bawerk to Austrian economics was to create an analysis of the economy as a whole. Karl Menger had just analyzed the process of price formation for individual prices and talked not very much about the relationships between different prices. That was the great contribution of Böhm-Bawerk's. And Mises was, of course, the most important disciple of Böhm-Bawerk, and you find these central ideas reflected in all of his works.
Yeah. Well, that's interesting. So you would say that the Hazlitt's chapter here is more Böhm-Bawerkian.
It's very Böhm-Bawerkian.
Yeah.
Yes.
That's great.
And of course, that's a fundamental contribution of Austrian economics that is unfortunately totally neglected by the mainstream today, was not neglected in the early 20th century, when Böhm-Bawerk was still widely read among economists all over the world. But unfortunately now, with this an unfortunate concentration on partial equilibrium analysis, or the unilateral focus on individual prices, individual industries, this whole message gets lost.
What about the next chapter? We're talking about stabilizing commodities.
It's a subject that becomes, again, of great importance in our day. We only need to think of the oil industry and the rants against the speculators on the market. It's an eternal subject. You know what the most important field of literature was in economic literature up to 1850, say? What the most important economic policy problem was?
Declining prices?
No, it was wheat, the wheat market.
Oh, interesting. Yeah.
And how to stabilize the wheat price, and could the market do it or not? Mm-hmm. This was about 40% of all economic writings concerned this problem.
So that's very, very interesting, because I don't know if you've had a chance to pick up this, and I highly recommend it, this Garrett novel called Satan's Bushel.
No, I do not yet know
which deals entirely with the whole wheat problem. But you do get the sense when you're reading that wow, this wheat stuff, this wheat problem is a big deal, because farmers felt like they couldn't really make a living, or they try to sell at a high price, but since they all sold at once, then the market would be flooded and the prices would go down.
Yeah,
and
so they're trapped by the market, and the government needs to protect them.
And did.
You need loan programs that allow the poor farmers to hold back their wheat and sell it in a proper point of time, and so on.
And
all these ideas.
Cartels, like the farmers would try to get together, but there was always invariably one or two that would break the price by secretly adding their bushels to the market.
Yes, and it is really not necessarily it might be to the advantage of the sub-marginal, that is the inefficient producers, but it's never in the interest of the efficient producers and of the consumer.
Yeah. Well, the Garrett book deals specifically with the advent of futures markets as the way to deal with the price problems.
Yeah.
But what Hazlitt's argument is that stabilizing prices is not really, stable prices is not an ideal that we want to try to seek to achieve, right?
Yes, because prices should, of course, reflect the changing conditions on the market. If you have one market segment that becomes increasingly important, let's say now the computer industry in the past 25 years, then you do not want to keep the prices where they were in 1980. They should reflect the ongoing changes in the volume of demand, for example, and the type of good that is being offered there.
But the general perception is that we can't permit an industry that's absolutely critical to the overall macroeconomic structure to just go through some sort of enormous upheaval suddenly. For example, housing, because that will drag the economy down with it.
Well, that's, of course, it's precisely the opposite way around. The more important an industry is, the more important it is that prices be flexible. And of course, we should not forget, and that's the point that is also stressed by Hazlitt, that the question how important a good is not liable to find a general answer. It is answered by each individual, each household, differently. So each household needs to be determined, how much money do I want to spend on housing, how much money do I want to spend on food, and so on. We cannot say this. I mean, your budget should be 30% on housing and then 20% on food and various other items. There are people who have completely different preferences. I always think in this context of a good friend of mine during my university years when I was a student. And so we were all very poor, of course. And some of them, they spend 50% of their budget on theater tickets. So what do you do about this? Do you want to impose on them and say, well, you've got to spend 50% on housing, you have to have a better apartment? They were living in a very shabby place, but yeah, they accepted this. There were more important things for them to buy.
Yeah. And this underscores the absurdity of something like speaking of a price level for the whole economy, doesn't it?
Well, what is important for the functioning of an economy is not the level of prices. Of course, we can always construe a mathematical average of all prices, and that's possible. You can observe the evolution of this aggregate of this basket throughout time. That is possible. But what is important for the functioning of the economy, for its operation, are the relations between prices, and again, more precisely, the relations between spending streams.
Yes.
An industry flourishes not if the price level is high. An industry flourishes if the level at which it has its selling receipts is superior to the level of cost expenditure, whatever the segment of the economy. Therefore, an economy can function very well at a high level of expenditure, at a low level of expenditure, at an increasing level of expenditure, and at a decreasing level of expenditure. It never matters what the level is. It always matters only, is there a positive spread between selling prices and buying prices.
And that requires absolute freedom of adjustment of prices.
And precisely if you have variations, if you have systematic changes, increases of the price level, for example, and decreases, the market must be free in order to adjust to this.
And so there are many markets, probably, I don't know, fewer, it seems, than in the past, in which the government fixes the price. Maybe this is more common in France than in the U.S. It seems like price fixing is not so much practiced in this country, except for the government-provided goods and services.
Yes.
You know. But of course, you have rent control and things like that. And
it is not important today in 2008 as it has been, say, in 1975.
Yeah.
So in those days, of course, we had very high inflation rates, and in America, you had the Nixon administration imposing a system of price and rent control. It always is. Bad things are always tried out again and again.
Right.
So what Hegel, the German philosopher, once said: the only thing that you learn from history is that you never learn from history. People never learn from history.
Yeah.
So therefore, also the importance of theoretical instruction, good economic training, because it's the principles that allow us to orient ourselves, whatever, in a changing historical context.
And there are, of course, always the emergency situations where the politicians threaten price controls and then don't actually impose them and intimidate producers. Have you seen this?
Yes.
Intimidate.
It constantly goes on. Yes.
People to lower their prices. Or to raise their prices.
Yes.
You know? Whatever it happens to
but the effect is actually the same. To the extent that they take this serious, it has very similar effects to an actual price control.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. And this goes on all the time. And even, I've wondered in the past how this affects certain markets. It's just the prospect that there will be investigations, or prospect that there'll be, for example, bad press. You know, can have an impact.
Oh, yes. Especially on financial markets, for example. And therefore, our government, both here in the US and in Europe, our governments try to massage the news.
Yeah.
So they have public relations agencies their own, and they also hire private public relationships to produce good news about capital markets in particular.
To keep prices going this way or that way.
Yeah.
But we do have odd views, don't we, about prices? We carry around this view, for example, in the United States. Everybody's convinced that that the price of oil should be far lower than it is. But the price of housing should be far higher than it is.
Yes.
You know?
Yeah.
And we just carry around these views with us without much thought.
Yes.
As to what it implies and just how arbitrary this is. Why is it that the price of oil should be lower?
Well, from a psychological point of view, of course, it's understandable. Everybody wants to sell at a high price and buy at very low prices. So we would like to have the oil price to be low because it allows us to drive very large and gas-consuming cars, and we would like to have the housing price very high because our wealth increases with it and so on. It's understandable. And we had a situation in the past 6 or 7 years in which precisely this happened. Housing went up and gas prices stayed fairly stable level. So there is a temptation for people to think that's the normal state of affairs, and it should always be that way. Well, but things are not always that way. And in fact, from the point of view of Austrian economic analysis, this situation was rather illusory. It was an artificial result of government interventionism in the economy that created a wrong impression for people.
And led to some degree of malinvestment.
Led certainly to too much investment in the housing market, too much consumption, because people believed that the increase of their housing value would be permanent, so they were taking out equity in order to pay for the university fees of their children, buy a new car, spend a nice vacation, and so on. Yeah. And therefore actually were consuming their capital and destroying wealth.
Now, one of the things that seems to be missing from these chapters that you would normally find in a regular economics text is some kind of graphical analysis. This is just words.
Yes.
Do you think that that the exposition suffers any for its lack of...
Not in the slightest.
Okay.
I believe that it's slightly irritating for those who have economic training today because they're precisely used to be confronted with graphical exposition in economic textbooks and in economic explanation. But for all others who come from other strands of life, no, I don't think so at all. Yeah. They orient themselves perfectly, and for them it's actually more difficult to find themselves, to orient themselves in a diagram.
Right. And Hazlitt's writing is a narrative.
Crystal clear and rigorous.
Yes.
Yeah. Just step by step.
Yes. Yeah. And it shows precisely, we do not really need this. Think, for example, of the typical exposition of price control in a neoclassical or mainstream textbook. Mm-hmm. It first of all illustrates an equilibrium situation on the housing market, for example, and then there's now, let's suppose the government fixes the price below the equilibrium price. And then you can show with demand curves and supply curves that there is a non-intersection between the two curves at this point, so demand is higher than supply, and you call this then a shortage. Very fine. Now, strictly speaking, that's not correct, because on the market is actually never in general equilibrium, and any single individual market is virtually never in equilibrium. So the proper way to present the economic law, the principle that is here at stake, is to say a price control has these consequences if it fixes the price below what the market would have established, irrespective of the question whether the market is in equilibrium or not. You see, so Hazlitt is actually more accurate in stating the economic principle than you could do it with the standard graphical exposition.
And here he follows J.B. Say, doesn't he?
Yes, and previous economists.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, thank you very much, Guido, for your wonderful
Great pleasure to be with you today.
This is Jeffrey Tucker. We're continuing our series on Economics 1 Lesson, the new edition from the Mises Institute. And I'm very excited to introduce George Reisman, who's joined us to discuss unions and wages. Dr. Reisman.
Well, very glad to be here, Jeff. Thank you for having me.
So we first tackled the issue of minimum wage laws, the almost universal confusion even after all these years. What does Hazlitt say about minimum wage?
Well, his basic point is that minimum wage laws or any legislation that raises wage rates above the free market level causes unemployment. And both of his discussions, I think, are excellent. And I don't know of any better book as an introduction to economics. And I've taught from it for many years in the past, always with very good results.
I see. Uh-huh.
And if you put his chapters on minimum wage and unions together, one of his main points is that unions cannot raise wage rates for all workers taken together. The most they can do is raise wage rates for some groups of workers. They cause unemployment in those particular fields. For example, if a carpenters union raises the wage rates of carpenters, there'll be fewer carpenters employed. The unemployed carpenters will then have to seek employment somewhere else. That enlarges the supply of labor elsewhere. And in order for them to be absorbed, wage rates in the new lines where they enter have to go down. So the unions make a gain for the carpenters who keep their jobs, but impose a loss on workers elsewhere in the economy. And then if we have unions throughout the economic system, the unions in the higher areas of skill force certain workers out into lower lines. That either depresses the wage rates in the lower lines, or if they have unions, the more skilled, better qualified workers cause less skilled workers to be unemployed. They then go down a rung lower, and then it concentrates at the bottom where you have the minimum wage laws, and then you simply end up with permanent unemployment. Now, many people who advocate repealing the minimum wage laws don't realize they hear the opposition well, the wage rates will be horrendously low to absorb the unemployed. The unemployed could be absorbed on much better terms if the repeal of minimum wages was coupled with the repeal of pro-union legislation, because then more people would be employed higher up the ladder. That would take the pressure off at the bottom.
Now, back in 1946, unions were far more prevalent.
Oh, yes.
Than they are today.
Right. And I did a review of an edition of Economics in One Lesson that came out, I think, in 1981. And I reread the book at that time, and one of the things I noticed was that here and there'd be some statement by Hazlitt, unions on the whole are pretty bad and destructive, except, of course, when workers are being underpaid or whatever. And I made the point that these statements seemed totally out of place. And I got a letter from Hazlitt who acknowledged that they didn't really make sense, but he had to put them in here and there just in order to have the book published when it appeared.
Yeah. It was a different world, really.
Yeah.
Almost, how much of the economy was, how much of the labor force was unionized in 1946? It was 40%?
Possibly much higher than today.
And something had to happen, didn't it? I mean,
Yeah.
it was on the verge of collapse.
Yeah, well...
Or stagnation, extreme stagnation.
Well, they were certainly a growing problem. I guess the Taft-Hartley Act set them back somewhat. But the natural effect of unions, especially if the industries in which they predominate are subject to foreign competition or non-union competition, the union's effect is to destroy those industries. So a major reason that the United States has lost so much of its manufacturing is the power of unions in such fields as automobiles, steel. People complain, or used to complain more, about Monday morning cars, because the workers would come in hungover from the weekend.
I've heard that phrase, that's funny.
Yeah. And that's a simple issue to solve. You tell them either you come in fit for work on Monday or don't bother to come in at all.
Right.
And so they could have improved the quality. But they couldn't do that because such action would provoke a major strike. So the American automobile industry lost greatly in competition because of the poor quality of the cars produced by union workers, their work rules that lower productivity, plus their wage demands, the pensions. I would say they're responsible in large measure for the destruction of our automobile industry, our steel industry, and other major industries.
I know here in Alabama we're benefiting from this in some way. We keep getting auto plants moving down, small engines.
So long as they remain non-union.
Yeah, and they move here because we don't have these we have open shop rules, and so the same thing has happened on an international level. The capital chases places that have relatively less restricted.
Yeah, it places our industries at a great handicap.
Yes, right. Now, what would you say to those? Well, let me ask it this way: are there any conditions under which minimum wage laws or laws favoring union organizations actually help workers?
I can't imagine any.
Okay.
I mean, they should be free to organize any voluntary association they want, but they should not have any right to prevent other people able and willing to do their jobs at a lower wage.
Well, this is a great confusion about this whole question of whether or not unions are voluntary or not. If you had a free market in labor, would we see anything like modern unions anywhere, to your mind?
I don't think we'd see unions organized for strikes and things of that kind. You might see fraternal associations, maybe people who work in the same plant. Maybe they want to have a softball team or something, or a burial fund, or God knows what. But I don't think you would see anything where they're organizing strikes and stoppages.
Right.
Because it would not be possible for any one group of workers to get significantly higher wages than other workers able to do their jobs.
Right. So the guild is just not likely to succeed over the long term, especially not in the modern age.
Exactly, not under economic freedom.
Right. Now, what about the next chapter? Hazlitt talks about this idea of enough to. The title is "Enough to Buy Back the Product." And
right.
Quotations. What does he mean by that?
Okay. Well, it's a popular argument of the unions, widely accepted, that the source of demand for the products is from the payment of wages. Now, it's certainly true that the workers' expenditure of their wages is a huge source of demand for products. But it cannot account for business profits, and you can't improve business profits by raising wages. And it's really a simple issue. On the one side, imagine that whatever wages are paid will be spent to buy consumers' goods, so they count as sales revenues. But on the other side, they count equivalently as costs. Now, if we add to the wages paid and the sales revenues, we're adding equals to whatever inequality we might have had. It doesn't increase the inequality. It doesn't add to profits. Now, as a matter of fact, suppose we started out, we had total spending to buy consumers' goods of 400 units of money. Each unit can be however many hundreds of billions of dollars or whatever. And 300 units of money spent to pay wages. Well, we could reasonably estimate profits at 100.
Right.
Okay, now, if we raised wages by 100 and the workers spent all the wages, now we'd have 400 of wages, 500 of sales, profits would still be 100, and as a percentage of sales and costs, they'd be lower.
Right.
Now, profit margins would go up if total wages went down, and even if sales revenues went down, because we're subtracting equals from unequals, the amount of the inequality is unaffected and becomes a larger percentage. Now, also, one of the things I've discovered, suppose we have a situation where we're trying to recover from a depression, and that there's substantial unemployment and wage rates need to fall. Now, suppose some of the funds previously used to pay wages are now instead devoted to the purchase of machinery. There's going to be the same total sales revenues. The wage earners might spend less for consumers' goods, but more is spent to buy the machines. And for a protracted period of time, costs in the economy will be less, because what you pay out as ordinary wages will show up as costs quite quickly. But if you're using those funds to buy a machine or construct a factory that lasts many years, the only element of cost is the depreciation. So profits would actually increase. And you see, this is what was typically believed. If you have mass unprofitability, as in a depression, you need a reduction in wage rates, in part to restore profitability.
Yes.
And it does so to the extent that expenditures are diverted to such things as machines and factory construction.
Yes. And do you expect that right now we're entering in a recessionary environment? Do you agree with that?
It certainly seems so. The potential is there.
Right.
For a major deflation.
And we're starting to see some response in the unemployment rate, right? It seems to be going up.
Right.
So in light of your exposition and in light of Hazlitt, what do you expect needs to happen?
Well, as far as unemployment becomes an issue, all legislation artificially propping up wage rates should be repealed.
Yeah.
But an even bigger issue that would need to be dealt with is the situation of the money supply and financial contraction.
Yeah.
And the potential is there right now. We could have something worse than 1929. I'm not saying we will, but the potential is there. And that would have to be addressed.
Does Hazlitt address the question of unemployment insurance?
He might, but I don't recall it. I don't.
Maybe you
so.
could elaborate on unemployment insurance.
Well, with unemployment insurance, if you mean people when they become unemployed are getting government
I should
funds.
say benefits. Really.
Yeah. All right. All right. Naturally. Well, that enables people to avoid looking for work for a while, and it prevents the fall in wage rates. You see, if you didn't have it, the pressure to reduce wage rates would be that much greater.
Yeah.
It would occur more quickly.
Yeah. And in Britain, unemployment insurance, which was very elaborate in the 1930s, actually prevented restoration of normal economic times.
Yes.
To even to a greater extent than the U.S. And yet, every time we go into a recession, Congress, Republicans and Democrats, are ready to jump in and...
Right. And one other thing I think is very important in this context. Even if you have unions just in a few key industries, and they're in a position to prevent a fall in wage rates in those particular industries, that operates to necessitate a vastly greater fall in wage rates in other industries, because when we try to expand production, we need to have expansion occurring more or less throughout the economy. Like suppose we wanted to produce more automobiles, but something was acting as a bottleneck in the production of copper. Yeah. Well, then that greatly retards our productivity in every area that depends on copper. So if you have unions in certain key fields whose expansion is being held back, in order to make the employment of people worthwhile elsewhere, you have to overcome this barrier of their productivity being artificially held down because of lack of supplies of complementary factors of production.
That's a very interesting point. So that even if unions constitute only, say, 5% of the private sector workforce,
they could still do a lot of damage. And now, I think they presently, I think it's more than 5 now. I think it's about 8 or 9%. To the extent that it's possible for workers easily to unionize, employers don't want that to happen, so many non-union employers routinely match the union scales to avoid giving the workers a reason to unionize, which means that the union wage demands are much wider, have a much wider influence than just in the unionized fields.
That would be an example of an unseen cost, I suppose.
Yeah. So they do, in fact, serve to raise wage rates very broadly, far beyond indicated by the percentage of their membership.
Now, in the public sector, unions are far more prevalent. Why is that?
Well, there, the employers are not operating in a market. They're not concerned with matters of profit and loss. They can pay anything, and the taxpayers end up footing the bill, and they're buying votes at the public's expense, and they can run bigger departments. So there, I think a good case can be made. No unions should be allowed, certainly in working for the government, because they're taking it's like taking advantage of a person incapable of taking care of himself. You know, the government has no profit and loss incentive. It's not its money. Right. So the unions are dealing with someone who can't offer appropriate resistance, and whose incentives are to constantly cater to them.
So when we see those public sector unions out protesting and demanding more wages, you should hold on to your wallet. Right?
Yeah. And that's their area of growth, because they destroy one private industry after another. And so in a way, the unions are vampire-like, because they need to find fresh blood in order to prosper.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Reisman, for your exposition today, which is very clear and wonderful.
Well, thank you.
I have a hard time imagining that Hazlitt could be more clear than you are.
Well, thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
This is Jeffrey Tucker with our continuing series on Economics in One Lesson, the new edition from the Mises Institute, and we're here talking today with Joseph Salerno from Pace University. We're covering 2 chapters, the function of profits, and then we get into an issue that's particularly important to us today, inflation. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Jeff.
So, let's talk about the function of profits.
Okay.
What is the chapter about?
Chapter basically points out that profits are a very small component of national income, but they're the most important component, because they're what motivates production. They're what motivates people to risk their livelihoods in order to attempt to forecast the future and future consumer needs, and to take the steps necessary to adjust production, to come up with new ideas, new types of goods, new qualities, better qualities of goods, and also to relentlessly lower the cost of producing goods through the application of newly discovered technology.
But now, when you say motivates, what if an entrepreneur says, you know, I really just don't care that much about profiting? What do you mean when you say motivating?
Well, profit is an indicator of success. Many entrepreneurs like Bill Gates, Sam Walton, Ray Kroc, if you read their biographies or autobiographies about them, They weren't motivated simply by money. They were motivated by a need to more or less actualize the vision that they had of a company that was serving consumer needs. So that's not to say that necessarily they were altruistic, but they were creative geniuses in a way that needed to actualize a vision that they had of producing a new good or a better good or a good at a much lower cost. In the case of Sam Walton and Walmart, cutting all unnecessary costs, getting rid of all inefficiencies, and bringing products to consumers at low prices.
So you're distinguishing between a profit motivation and a money motivation.
That's correct. Profit motivation is what motivates the entrepreneur in the sense that the entrepreneur is continuously scanning the market for undervalued resources, and then with the intention of combining them and then bringing them to market in a much higher valued product.
Okay.
So this is the motivation of the entrepreneur.
So the profit serves then as a signal that he's done the right thing, that he's doing the right thing, as a sign to indicate possible future actions, just as a way of sealing up their good work.
Yeah, absolutely. It does signal success in what they've done, but they can't keep that success for themselves. That's the other thing. Profits are a signal in some sense, and they grab the attention of other entrepreneurs and who want to emulate these entrepreneurs and similarly earn a profit.
Yeah, and quite often these profits are not just put into yachts and big boats and things like that, but turned back into the company.
Yeah,
if you're going to expand,
absolutely.
you have to have a profit.
Right. For example, Sam Walton was continuously plowing his profits back into his firm. For example, he himself had a rule for all people traveling on company business. They would always share a hotel room, and when he traveled, he shared hotel rooms with one of his employees.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting thing that if you could imagine a world without profit, you would have a world where business just continued to do the same thing.
Right.
And say there weren't neither profits nor losses, you would have to just have a completely static economy.
It would be a very stagnant economy. It would be a static economy. Actually, that's the definition of a static economy. An economy where there's no profits or losses.
Right.
People can be changing their demands, and firms would be changing products, increasing some, decreasing others, but there would be no growth of the economy without positive profits.
Right.
And by the way, we can't leave out losses. In this chapter, we discuss losses, or Hazlitt discusses losses, and points out that fact that in an economy, nearly as many firms are losing money as are earning money, or are earning profits. Excuse me. And we can see this last quarter, Ford lost $8.7 billion because they were producing SUVs and trucks that were not adjusted to the price of gasoline, so people were reducing their demand.
It signals a business mistake.
Yeah, that signals a past business mistake, a waste of resources. They are using resources that have a higher value to consumers in other areas than the product that is being produced.
Yeah. So, I mean, if you were going to construct a system that said, well, we need some kind of system in which people that are using resources efficiently and serving others need to be somehow rewarded so they can continue to do that at a more expansive level than they had done before. You would put together something like the profit system.
Yeah, that's what would come out of that speculation, if you thought about it.
Yeah.
But no one mind can reproduce that in any sense. So that's why public ownership or collectivist ownership under socialism can never work, because they can't really construct this very sensitive network of profits and losses.
Yeah, inconceivable apart from private property and free exchange.
Absolutely.
And a free price system. Yeah. Who was it that said that cost accounting was the greatest invention in the history of the world?
Well, that was Ludwig von Mises.
Okay.
Because,
I should know this.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
Because this is what allows a businessman to oversee all his operations, to reduce some areas, to get rid of some of his managers that are not adjusting to the conditions according to his own plan that he lays out for his whole business.
Yeah, and there have been socialist systems that attempted to replicate the profit loss system.
Yeah, that's true. They make up, they use phony prices, or they copy the prices that they see on world markets, so they can crudely calculate in some sense in the real world. But no socialist system has actually use prices that were developed through a computer or through a trial and error method. There were many theories in the 1930s that the socialist society could replicate the market price system.
Yeah.
But that's already admitting, of course, that you need prices. But what they could never do is replicate profits and losses.
Right.
Okay. Socialist businesses don't go out of business.
Well, I suppose part of the problem is that just because you made a profit today, or this week, or last month, or last year, doesn't really tell you anything for sure about the future.
That's
right?
absolutely true. IBM dominated the computer industry in the 1970s, and now they're simply a minor player in the computer industry. You can think of the big three automotive companies in the U.S. dominating auto production into the early 1980s, and now all three of them are losing large amounts of money, and GM is cutting workers, and Ford is closing down plants.
So when you look at, when a businessman looks at his accounting sheet and sees profits, it seems like it's a ratification only that in the past you've done well. But it doesn't give you an indication of what's going to happen in the future. You know, it strikes me that the whole thing is relentless. The whole project of enterprise, of productive enterprise, is relentlessly terrifying.
That's a good word. It is relentless. There's a selective process going on that weeds out those people who are not currently serving consumers, and it's done by consumers abstaining from buying certain products and increasing their purchases of other products. And it is relentless, and it takes no view of the past. It's concerned with what is going on right now. Am I being satisfied by these products right now?
And does the more profitable enterprise have, in some sense, an advantage? The large business have an advantage over the small business in this respect?
No, not at all. In fact, again, the person who earns a profit is the person we call the entrepreneur, and the entrepreneur can always come up with new ideas, and these can be hatched, these new ideas, in garages, as Apple under Stephen Jobs was. And Apple came from nowhere to outcompete IBM in personal computers, and Microsoft similarly came with operating systems. It was a tiny company which exploded because it served consumers. So exploded with success is what I was intending to mean there. And so a big company, unless it has some kinds of government regulations and privileges, cannot continue its success without continuously changing its products according to consumer demand.
And profitability becomes more and more difficult, too, with the large business, because you've got ever higher costs.
Right. Your costs are high, you have higher sunk costs, you're not as nimble, you're not as flexible, you can't move around as quickly, whereas a new business can easily adopt a new technology and can change its production in a moment's notice.
And it must be especially difficult nowadays with technology constantly moving forward all the time. And if you get attached to a certain way of doing things that's profitable, you think, well, we just need to do that again. And you turn around, you wake up the next day and everything's different. And your competitors are using something that does the work twice as much work at half the cost.
Yeah, you often hear about an entrenched corporate culture. There's a certain culture, and some people hold this up as being good. But the fact is the culture has to change according to consumers' demands and according to technological conditions and cost conditions.
So how do these large businesses keep up? I suppose the cost accounting is always the signal, always the
right. There's always a signal, and the past always does give them some information about experience, and then they judge this, they analyze it, and they try to extrapolate and forecast consumer demand in the future, technological conditions in the future, and so on.
Now, we're speaking about profit as if it's just one thing, but there's a range of profitability, right?
That's absolutely true.
And the more profitable industries will tend to inspire others to emulate them. Right.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you'll have, as we had with the high-tech industries, expanding and becoming more profitable, even as prices have fallen, and there's been a tremendous expansion in their output. There was something, the first personal computer was $20,000 in 1980. We can now get personal computers for $500.
Yeah.
The shipments were 500,000 in 1980. By 2000, even though the prices were much lower, they were producing and shipping something like 11 million units.
Yeah. You know, I think about this all the time because just as our own internal example, which is just minor and completely petty, but you know that for years people were advocating that the Mises Institute have small flash disks that were customized, let's say the Mises Institute. I looked into the prices and I was terrified to buy them in January because you have to buy a certain quantity. I thought, how many of these things can we
Right.
sell? By the fall, well, 6 months later, you looked at the cost of these things, and they had fallen by half. And then a full year later, they were really 10% of what. Now, if we had bought that inventory at the beginning
Right.
and not sold it, I mean, that's just a potential disaster waiting to happen. I don't frankly understand how these companies can do this.
Well, it's just, as you pointed out before, it's the fact that the competitive process driven by profit motivation is relentless. And one way to make profit is to continually lower your cost on the same product that you're producing.
Right.
So this is why we have a continual fall in prices in the high-tech industries.
I think we tend to think of entrepreneurship as a one-time thing. Like somebody has an idea, here's a product people are liking, and
Right.
you come up with it, you market it, and it sells. But it's a daily thing, isn't it?
It absolutely is. You're continuously fine-tuning the product itself and the pricing process that you're using, or the pricing procedures that you're using to price the product. You can look at the airlines where prices are continually changing. They're continually changing the space between the seats, what they're feeding you, and so on.
Yeah, but I suppose that you have to have a certain kind of personality to thrive on that kind of relentless roiling around every day, that sense of uncertainty and terror. Really, what's tomorrow going to look like?
You have to be willing to risk your livelihood and even your destiny with the very optimistic expectation that you can do better than your rivals in serving consumers. And so entrepreneurs are fundamentally optimistic, and some of them may be overly optimistic.
Yeah.
But that is one of their important traits.
Yeah. So not everybody is capable of this, and it's a selective portion
Right.
of the population.
Absolutely
and
right.
they're benefactors, really, to the rest of us.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no doubt about that.
Now, the next chapter concerns the issue of inflation, and maybe as a segue, you could just mention we're experiencing some inflationary times right now, focused on particular sectors, oil and other things, but everything. How does inflation affect doing business?
Inflation falsifies cost accounting because when the entrepreneurs look around, they see that prices have risen and that their costs, which are recorded at their historical levels, are much lower, so they seem like they have profits. But these turn out to be paper profits because they have to replace these raw materials and the machinery and so on at much higher prices later on. And so inflation causes a misallocation of resources. In fact, it causes a consumption of capital as people begin to spend these profits on consumption goods rather than put them aside with the intent of spending them on replacing their capital at higher prices.
And why would it bias us towards consumption as opposed to investment?
Oh, because as I said, profits look much higher.
Okay.
Because the costs are things that you've recorded at pre-inflation prices.
Yeah.
There's a conservative bias in accounting which records costs at their historical level. Mm-hmm. And so when inflation breaks out, prices are the first thing to rise, and entrepreneurs see higher profits. And they might plow some of this back into their business, but in fact they have to plow all of it back in to take account of the fact that the costs when they replace these inputs are going to be much higher.
Then they have to worry about selling prices, right?
In what sense?
I mean, then they have to raise their prices for consumers, and they don't know how that's going to affect the demand for the product.
Well, exactly. With inflation, it's ragged or uneven. That is, some prices are affected more than other prices, and at times some industries will suffer in inflation. That is to say, the money that's being spent on their industry will lag behind the spending on other industries. So they will not be able to raise their prices as quickly as their costs are going up. So they will be squeezed, and they'll have to reduce production.
Now, the way you tell the story, it seems inevitable that you would tend to see decreased production and a greater number of business failures in an inflationary environment. But that hasn't always been the macroeconomic theory, right?
Right.
Can you account for that and explain how it is that economists came to believe that inflation was compatible with fast economic growth?
Well, there's a naive view, and the naive view is that anytime you print more money and there's a greater spending in the economy, then we have greater wealth, greater money wealth, and that's sort of just an illusion, of course. In order to have greater prosperity in the economy, you have to have more goods, and more money does not automatically bring forth more goods.
Right.
But the more sophisticated view is that there's always a margin of unemployed resources, and that increased spending will bring about a situation in which you'll raise some prices, and that will make it more profitable to hire the unemployed labor, to utilize the unused factory space and so on. And that will then create prosperity. So in the second, more sophisticated case, they don't focus on printing a lot of money and just driving prices up. They focus on filling a deflationary gap. That is, that spending is just falling short of the potential output of the economy at going prices. So you want to raise spending moderately to allow all the goods that are being produced to be purchased by consumers and by investors.
An inflationary recession is not so much an anomaly. It's something you would just tend to expect.
Yeah. At some point when prices begin to rise at rapid rates that are politically unpopular or that the Fed does not want to continue, the Fed will stop inflating at that rate of increasing the money supply at that high rate, will cut back, interest rates will rise, and prices of investment goods will begin to fall, and we'll begin to see firms going out of business, laying off workers, mainly in the capital goods industry.
Right.
So, but you'll still have prices rising of consumer goods because all the money has not been percolated through the economy. So you'll get an inflation as well as a recession. And that's known as the Austrian theory of the business cycle.
Or so-called stagflation.
Yeah, or stagflation.
Yeah. And how do non-Austrian schools account for stagflation?
Non-Austrian schools would account for stagflation as a result of an exogenous shock, what they call a shock from outside the economy. All of a sudden, oil prices rise.
Yeah.
So costs are higher. Firms then produce less goods, so you have a recession. But at the same time, prices are going higher because the price of the inputs are higher.
Yeah.
So they posit these sort of outside shocks that suddenly cause these losses in the economy and reduction in output. Higher food prices, for example, is another example of or another way in which the economy can experience a stagflation.
That doesn't sound like a very systematic theory at all.
No, it really isn't. It's really an ad hoc theory to explain what happened in the 1970s, beginning in the 1970s.
Now, Hazlitt was writing this book in 1946. What was happening in terms of inflation in 1946 that caused him to zero in on this issue?
Well, we had price controls, as most wartime economies do, throughout World War II. And there was a big debate about how quickly to decontrol the U.S. economy. And there was fear that if prices were taken, price controls were removed, prices would rise. And in fact, they would rise, but the point is they'd be telling the truth about the relationship between the money supply and the amount of goods in the economy. And it would only be a one-time rise in prices. But it would be very visible. Yes.
It's striking, though, that Hazlitt would zero in on this point about inflation, given that we just went through this long period of history where there was a hysteria about deflation.
Right.
You know, and yet, to Hazlitt's mind, the inflation would pose the greatest danger.
Yeah, he's actually. Yeah, the other point is that in demobilization of the economy and having more people in the labor force, that is, the soldiers that were returning from Europe and the Japanese theater of war, there was a fear by mainstream economists that the economy would go into a depression.
Yeah.
Because the government was spending less on war goods and less on other things to clothe and feed the soldiers. But in fact, Hazlitt knew that if the government tried to offset this recession, this imminent, what they believe was an imminent depression, with an increase of the money supply, we would have now a peacetime inflation, which would distort prices and eventually cause misallocations and recession again.
Do you think Hazlitt's explanation holds up?
Yep, I think it holds up today as well as it did in 1946.
Yeah. Well, very good. Thank you so much, Dr. Salerno.
Okay, thank you, Jeff. My pleasure.
This is Jeffrey Tucker. I'm here with another segment of our systematic walk through Economics in One Lesson, chapter by chapter. And now we're on the very last chapter, which is saving. Chapter on saving, which is packed with information that's relevant to today's economic situations. And I have with me Roger Garrison at Auburn University, our expert on business cycle and macroeconomics generally. Dr. Garrison?
Thank you. Glad to talk about Hazlitt's book.
Okay, tell me about his chapter on saving. Perhaps you can begin with where we were in 1946 when he wrote this and why he wrote it.
It's a great chapter. He talks about saving as sort of the essence of the problem of the economic thinking of the time. He doesn't mention John Maynard Keynes even once in that chapter. Mentions very few names, but of course that's who he's talking about. Keynes was against saving because he thought it was spending that got us prosperity. And Hazlitt was there to show us that saving just shows up as spending in another form, and a more socially useful form at that.
It seems strange that it would even be a controversy at all to say that saving is actually a good thing, since from an individual point of view, it's always a good thing. In fact, doesn't he tell something of a story that relates macroeconomics to individual saving?
Yes, the two brothers
Right.
Each inherited a good sum of money, and one spends it on consumption, the other one spends very little and saves. And the popular view is that the one that spends is helping the community by creating jobs. But Hazlitt's point, of course, is the one that saves is helping the community more by funneling the savings through investment and increased growth in the economy and increased output in the future.
And this, again, returns to his theme of what is seen and unseen.
That's right. It also, what's involved here is the issue of whether the markets work or not. The economist, Keynes in particular, who argued that spending is good and saving is bad, they argued that partly because they didn't think the market could transform saving into investment. And Hazlitt is just right on when he brings in the interest rate and identifies that as the market mechanism, as the relevant price that translates saving into investment. The interest rate adjusts so that however much is saved is borrowed by the business community and spent on investment projects, creating output for the future.
This error that consumption is the reason for economic growth is still pervasive, isn't it?
It is. And it shows up with these throat-clearing remarks on the news about consumption is 70% of the economy or whatever the current percentage is, as if that's what we need to pay attention to because that's what drives the economy. It also goes back to Keynes' view that all of the macro magnitudes move up and down together. And so if you want to get the economy as a whole, output as a whole to move up and down, well, work on consumption. That's the biggest component. Get it to move up.
And that's because Keynes wasn't thinking in terms of intertemporal coordination of economic forces.
That's right. His level of aggregation in his theory didn't allow him to deal with that issue at all.
And so consumption is now, saving is in the future. And what comes out, so anything we consume now comes out of the future. That's the idea, and this model wasn't part of his thinking at all. Everything was simultaneous.
Well, actually, according to Keynes, saving was just a leakage from the system. It even shows up in the early textbooks, in Samuelson's textbook, for instance, as a hydraulic device that has a leak, and what's leaking out is called saving. Doesn't go anywhere. It doesn't help the economy. But again, it's the breakdown of the market in Keynes' view that gave him that result. He didn't think the interest rate functioned to coordinate saving and investment.
And we still see, I guess in 46 there were attacks on hoarding.
That's right.
Especially in wartime. I can't imagine what people must have been going through.
That's right.
That would be the first impulse, would be to, if you get something, hold it.
That's right, yeah. In some market conditions, there's good reason to hoard, although hoarding is a pejorative term. I remember Murray Rothbard used to define hoarding as you holding more money than I think you ought to hold. But everybody holds money, and they make their own choices about how much of it to hold. Hazlitt indicates that hoarding is rarely a root problem of any macroeconomic problem or any macroeconomic situation. It may well be that some people hoard more than others, and that people hoard more at some times than others. But typically, if it's a problem, it's triggered by some policy perversity that gave rise to it.
increasing uncertainty and risk, and people respond. Yeah, and of course, you never hold just to hold things forever. You hold with the intention to eventually consume. In any case,
that's right.
Yeah,
that's right. The same thing for savings, by the way. That the savings is treated as just a dead end.
Yeah.
Even in modern macroeconomic theory, it's pretty much a dead end. In the classroom, I like to use the expression "saving up for something" as opposed to simply saving, to emphasize that people are building up purchasing power in order to exercise it sometime in the future.
Now, this war on saving that Hazlitt seems to identify, it's been rather effective, hasn't it?
Yes, yes, I think it has. The lesson is well learned in that book, and that savings does make its way into investment, and it does give rise to economic growth.
And what's happened to savings over the years, and what's happening to savings right now?
Savings in this country right now is at an all-time low. The statistics on saving out of income, as they express it, is essentially zero.
Yes.
That doesn't mean that nobody saves. It just means that a lot of people are spending more than they're earning, and in large part by second mortgages, by mortgaging the house and spending out of that. And so if you look at total spending, it's about equal to total income, which means no saving out of income.
Now, if I make some money and go and spend it on stocks, is that saving or consumption?
Well, buying the stocks is saving. And then what the firm does with the funds, the firm that sold the stock, what they do with the funds is called investment. They buy plant and equipment, tools and machinery, capital goods to increase future output.
So as people pull money out of the stock market, presumably that seems to be the trend right now, and put it into what? Some other riskless investment like government bonds. Is that a tendency towards greater saving, or is it completely neutral?
That's still saving. It's not such a hopeful saving if it's being channeled into the government rather than in the private sector.
Yeah.
But certainly in the statistics, if you look up statistics on saving, it doesn't distinguish between how much of that saving is borrowed by firms and how much is borrowed by the government. Although we know that if the government borrows a hefty dose of it, that crowds out, that's the common term, it crowds out private sector activity.
Yeah.
And you end up with a less productive use of the saving.
In an ideal world, well, let me just ask it this way. Can you imagine a world in which there would be no such thing as bonds, such as government bonds, that have absolutely no risk premium, that have a fixed return on them? I mean, is that a world, do you think, we could live in?
I don't think that's a world that could exist. And in fact, even with government bonds, it's not that there's no risk, it's just that the risk isn't borne by the people holding the bonds. The risk is borne, it's as if it was shunted into the Atlantic Ocean, but of course it isn't. It's shunted onto the rest of us who are responsible for cleaning up the mess once things get all fouled up.
And this relates to the business cycle, which I think Hazlitt very cleverly, or maybe it wasn't clever, it was just the way his narrative works. But in this chapter, he discusses the cause of the business cycle.
He does, and you can tell the whole story of the business cycle just by focusing on that loan market. That if the interest rate is telling the truth, in other words, if it's actually reflecting people's willingness to save, then the economic growth we get is sustainable, is healthy growth, and it's all good. But if the interest rate is distorted, in other words, is made to tell a lie, and is too low, then the economy is set off on an unsustainable growth path, and eventually it all comes undone. That's the bust phase of the cycle.
Does Hazlitt use the phrase forced saving here?
I don't think he does. The concept is there for sure. The term itself has been used to mean many different things, even among the Austrian economists. And it's not surprising that Hazlitt, who has a reputation for being such a clear writer, and that's one of the things that characterizes this book, would avoid that term. Okay, not because he disagrees with the concept, but because there are clearer ways of expressing the ideas, which he does very nicely.
you might say rather illusory saving or imaginary saving, or how would you put it?
Well, Hayek called it policy-induced investment, policy-induced capital accumulation. In other words, what's called for saving is really a form of investment. It's committing resources to early stages of production that can't be completed because there's no genuine saving to see them through the process.
So what you're speaking about is a pure model of an Austrian business cycle, but every business cycle is different, right?
Yes.
Right. So you can't expect the same features from everyone.
That's true.
Yeah.
That's true. In fact, what tends to happen is that business cycles tend to ride piggyback on whatever happens to be going on at the time. And here we can see similarity and differences between current situation and earlier situations. For instance, in the 1920s, there were technological innovations, mass production of automobiles in the chemical industry and in processed food because of electrification and all that. And the artificially low interest rate just caused an increase there beyond what could actually be sustained. Okay, so you got a boom of that sort. In the 1990s, you had a digital revolution going on, a genuine digital revolution. But the lower interest rate under the Clinton administration just magnified that beyond what could be sustained. Okay, and so now we have a similar thing. The difference is that it's not something that's going on in the market that got amplified, but some policy perversity, namely subsidizing home ownership, which was a perversity in and of itself, but it got even amplified further by the increase in the money supply and the low interest rate.
Well, you know, I think that's an excellent insight, and it helps account for this point that the new credit, that the business cycle sort of piggybacks on whatever happens to be going on at the time.
That's true.
And that's
what makes them different.
Okay, and that's partially what accounts for the theory that the cause of the business cycle is some sort of technological shock.
Right.
That's also an illusion, isn't it? Because it's confusing cause and effect, or it's misidentifying the causal factors.
That's true. That's true. And it also derives from the fact that the Federal Reserve adopts this real bills doctrine, which suggests that they supply credit at currently available interest rates, which essentially causes them to pump money into credit markets when there's an increased demand for credit, rather than let the interest rate adjust to that new market condition.
Is there any way to know for sure whether or not the interest rate that the Fed is seeking to achieve is the correct one or not?
No, actually there isn't, but that's not at all surprising. In the same sense, there would have been no way in the Soviet Union to figure out what the price of shoes ought to be if only the government is creating shoes.
So you can't say, well, it's too high, it's too low.
You need a market to tell you what the price of shoes would be, and you need a decentralized banking system to tell you what the interest rate should be.
Okay, so your proposal then isn't for the Fed to do a better job at what it does.
Right.
It's to have it stop doing what it's doing and let the market.
Right, all right. We need decentralized banking.
Okay. And this is a position that Hazlitt endorses or not?
He doesn't get into that. He doesn't get into that. The spirit of Hazlitt suggests that he well might.
Yeah, very good. Well, thank you very much, Dr. Garrison.
Thank you.